In the cliffs on the western bank of the Nile at Thebes, cut into the limestone face of the desert escarpment, there is a building that should not exist. It is a mortuary temple, the specific architectural form that the Egyptian pharaohs of the New Kingdom built to house the eternal rituals of their funerary cults. But it does not look like any other mortuary temple in the history of the Egyptian tradition. It rises from the desert floor in 3 ascending colonnaded terraces, each lined with squared pillars, each connected by a central ramp, each pressing further into the cliff face until the uppermost terrace merges with the rock itself. The effect is not the effect of a building placed on a landscape. It is the effect of a building emerging from a landscape, as if the cliff had opened and the temple had grown outward from the stone. The temple is called Djeser Djeseru, Holy of Holies, and it was built by the most powerful woman who ever ruled Egypt. She was not a queen. She was not a regent. She was the pharaoh, the full, titled, cartouche-holding, 5-name-bearing pharaoh of the Egyptian state, depicted in the specific male regalia of the pharaonic office, governing with the full institutional authority that the most powerful single office in the ancient world conferred. She ruled for approximately 22 years. She built more monuments than almost any pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. She sent a trading expedition to the distant land of Punt that became one of the most celebrated achievements of her reign, and one of the most richly documented expeditions in the entire history of the ancient world. She erected obelisks at Karnak whose inscriptions specifically addressed the question of why a woman was occupying the pharaonic office. And she commissioned a divine birth narrative, a specific theological text and relief program at her mortuary temple that presented the god Amun himself as her divine father, the specific theological justification for her right to rule. And then, after her death, someone tried to erase her. Her images were defaced, her cartouches were chiseled from the walls, her statues were smashed and buried. The specific program of erasure was extensive enough to remove her from the accessible public record of the New Kingdom, making her, for more than 3,000 years, one of the most significant and most invisible rulers in the history of the ancient world. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not just who Hatshepsut was, but why the specific character of her achievement, the most fully expressed and the most extensively documented example of female pharaonic rule in the history of the Egyptian tradition, is one of the most important stories in the entire 5,000-year arc of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. And you are going to understand why the erasure that followed her death was not what the popular telling has long claimed it to be. Not the revenge of a bitter stepson, but something more complex, more institutional, and more revealing about the specific character of the Egyptian political system. Before we get started, if you find these stories as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. The specific combination of Hatshepsut's achievement and her erasure is the most dramatic available example of the tension between individual accomplishment and institutional convention in the history of the Egyptian state. She accomplished more than most male pharaohs of her dynasty. She was erased more thoroughly than almost any pharaoh in the New Kingdom's history. The accomplishment and the erasure are both real, both are documented, and both require the specific examination that this account provides. The series has been building toward this account across its full arc. The preceding accounts of female authority in the Egyptian tradition, Mernith in the 1st dynasty, Sobekneferu in the 12th, Tai and Nefertiti and Kia and Ankhesenamun in the 18th, have each examined a specific dimension of the Egyptian tradition's engagement with female political capacity. Each found a different form of expression. Each operated within the specific institutional constraints of its period. Hatshepsut broke through those constraints. She did not simply extend the queenly role, as Tai had done. She did not simply occupy the theological center of a revolutionary program, as Nefertiti had done. She took the pharaonic office itself, the full 5-name titulary, the cartouche, the male regalia, the divine birth narrative, and held it for 22 years in the most accomplished and the most extensively documented female pharaonic reign in the history of the Egyptian state. 22 years, the full pharaonic office. the most accomplished female reign in the history of the ancient world. Her name was Hatshepsut, and her story, the achievement, the erasure, and the modern recovery, begins now. Her story begins in the sections that follow, with the temple at Deir el-Bahari, with the expedition to Punt, with the obelisks at Karnak, with the divine birth narrative, with the erasure that tried to make her invisible, and with the modern archaeology that made her visible again. Her name was Hatshepsut. The account begins now. The account begins. The most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world. Her name was Hatshepsut. Now, Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I, the warrior pharaoh who had extended Egyptian military power deep into Nubia and the Near East in the early 18th dynasty. And Queen Ahmose, a woman of royal blood whose specific dynastic connection gave Hatshepsut the most direct possible claim to the royal succession. She was married to her half-brother Thutmose II, who succeeded their father on the throne, and who died after a relatively short reign, leaving behind a young son, Thutmose III, born not to Hatshepsut but to a secondary wife named Isis. The young Thutmose III was a child when his father died, too young to govern independently, and the specific institutional mechanism that the Egyptian tradition deployed for minority successions was the mechanism this series has examined multiple times: the regency. The Queen Mother, or the most senior royal woman, assumed the governing authority of the state during the young pharaoh's minority, exercising the institutional functions of the pharaonic office on behalf of the child king. Hatshepsut became the regent, and then, within approximately 7 years of the regency, she did something that no regent in the history of the Egyptian tradition had done before. She assumed the full pharaonic titulary, the 5-name system that identified the ruling pharaoh as the specific divine occupant of the Horus throne, and began to be depicted in the male pharaonic regalia that the institutional conventions of the office required. She did not remove Thutmose III from his nominal pharaonic position. The specific institutional arrangement that she created was unprecedented, a co-regency in which she held the senior pharaonic authority and Thutmose III held the junior position, both nominally pharaohs, but with Hatshepsut exercising the governing authority. This specific arrangement, the female senior pharaoh governing alongside the male junior pharaoh, was maintained for approximately 15 years, from approximately year 7 of the nominal reign of Thutmose III through Hatshepsut's death, approximately 22 years after she first assumed the regency. The specific institutional significance of this arrangement cannot be overstated. The pharaonic office was, in the specific theological and institutional logic of the Egyptian tradition, a male office. The pharaoh was Horus, the male falcon deity whose specific divine identity was the foundation of the pharaonic ideology. The pharaoh was the son of Ra, the male solar deity whose specific relationship to the ruling king was the theological foundation of the royal authority. Every element of the pharaonic representational system, the crowns, the regalia, the titles, the specific bodily forms in which the pharaoh was depicted, was male. Hatshepsut took all of this. She took the Horus name, she took the son of Ra name, she took the crowns and the regalia, and she was depicted, progressively across her reign, in the male bodily form that the pharaonic representational conventions required, initially as a woman wearing male regalia, and eventually as a fully male figure with the false beard and the male proportions of the conventional pharaonic representation. This specific progression, from female body with male regalia to fully male representation, has been analysed by scholars, including Anne Macy Roth, as the specific process by which the Egyptian representational system accommodated a female ruler within conventions that had been designed exclusively for male occupants. The accommodation was not instantaneous. It was a process, a gradual working out of how the conventions could be adapted for a situation they had not been designed to handle. The scale of Hatshepsut's building program, the specific material expression of her pharaonic authority, was extraordinary by any standard. The mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, the obelisks at Karnak, 2 massive granite shafts, each approximately 29.5 meters tall, quarried at Aswan and transported to Thebes and erected in the great temple of Amun, The Red Chapel at Karnak, a specific ritual structure whose relief carvings are among the most detailed surviving records of the 18th dynasty's religious program. The building projects at Buhen in Nubia, at Paket's temple at Beni Hassan, and at multiple other sites across Egypt and Nubia. The specific quantity of building, the number of sites, the scale of the individual projects, the specific quality of the artistic program was, by the specific scholarly assessment of the Egyptologist Peter Dorman and others who have studied the building record in detail, equal to or greater than the building output of most male pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. She was not a marginal or a token pharaoh. She was one of the most productive builders of her dynasty. The expedition to Punt, the trading voyage to the distant land on the African coast, whose specific goods, myrrh trees, gold, ebony, exotic animals, incense, were brought back to Egypt and deposited in the temple of Amun at Karnak, was the single most celebrated achievement of the reign in the contemporary record. The expedition is depicted in extraordinary detail on the walls of the Deir el-Bahari temple, the specific ships, the specific journey, the specific arrival at Punt, the specific encounter with the rulers of Punt, including the famous depiction of Queen Ati, the ruler's wife, whose specific physical form, extremely large, with specific physical features that the Egyptian artist recorded with their characteristic naturalistic precision, is one of the most discussed individual images in the history of Egyptian art. The Punt expedition was not primarily a military campaign. It was a trading expedition, a specific demonstration of the Egyptian state's capacity to organize and execute a complex long-distance commercial venture across the waters of the Red Sea to the African coast. The specific character of the expedition, commercial rather than military, has been noted by scholars as reflecting the specific character of Hatshepsut's reign, a reign focused on building, trade, and the institutional elaboration of the royal religious program, rather than on the military campaigns that had characterized her father's reign, and that would characterize her stepson's subsequent reign. The specific scholarly tradition that has engaged with Hatshepsut's reign is among the most extensive in New Kingdom studies. Herbert Winlock's excavations at Deir el-Bahari in the 1920s and 30s CE established the archaeological foundation. Suzanne Ratier's comprehensive study was the first modern monograph on the Queen. Peter Dorman's analysis of Senenmut and of the erasure question revolutionized the scholarly understanding of the late reign and its aftermath. Catherine Roerig's exhibition catalogue assembled the most comprehensive visual documentation, and Kara Cooney's accessible biography brought the story to the broadest available audience. The foundation is established, the scale is clear. The core problem, the specific question of the erasure and what it actually meant, follows in section 3. Her name was Hatshepsut. The core problem begins now. The core problem begins now. But the foundation requires two more essential elements: the specific character of Senenmut and his relationship to Hatshepsut's reign, and the specific character of the divine birth narrative that provided the theological justification for her rule. Senenmut was the most important single individual at Hatshepsut's court, the official who held more titles than any other non-royal person of the 18th dynasty, who served as the architect of the Deir el-Bahari temple, the tutor of Hatshepsut's daughter Noferure, and the holder of the specific administrative positions that made him the most powerful figure in the governing apparatus of the state. His specific institutional career, the accumulation of an extraordinary number of titles and positions across the years of Hatshepsut's reign, has been the subject of detailed study by Peter Dorman, whose comprehensive monograph on Senenmut is the most authoritative treatment of the subject. The specific relationship between Hatshepsut and Senenmut has been the subject of considerable speculation in both the scholarly and the popular literature. The popular tradition has tended toward romantic interpretation, the queen and her architect as lovers, the political and the personal intertwined. The scholarly tradition has been more cautious, noting that the specific evidence for a romantic relationship is circumstantial, and that the institutional relationship, the patron-client relationship between the pharaoh and her most important official, is sufficient to explain the specific character of Senenmut's prominence, without requiring the additional hypothesis of a personal romantic connection. What is not in dispute is the specific quality of the institutional relationship. Senenmut was Hatshepsut's most important official. The Deir el-Bahari temple, his most visible architectural achievement, was one of the most innovative and most accomplished buildings in the history of Egyptian architecture, and his specific administrative management of the affairs of state was one of the foundations on which the specific accomplishments of Hatshepsut's reign were built. Senenmut disappears from the record approximately in year 16 of Hatshepsut's reign, approximately 6 years before her own death. His specific fate is unknown. He may have died, he may have fallen from favor, or he may have retired from active service. His tomb, 2 tombs in fact, one at Sheikh Abdel Qurna and one beneath the Deir el-Bahari temple, were never completed, and the specific significance of their incompleteness has been debated. The divine birth narrative is the second essential foundational element. Hatshepsut commissioned a specific relief and text program at Deir el-Bahari that depicted the god Amun visiting her mother Queen Ahmose and fathering Hatshepsut through the specific mechanism of divine conception. The narrative, carved on the walls of the middle terrace of the temple, showed Amun taking the form of Thutmose I, entering the queen's chamber and conceiving Hatshepsut through the divine breath. This divine birth narrative was a specific theological argument for Hatshepsut's right to rule. The argument was, she was not simply the daughter of a pharaoh who had died. She was the daughter of Amun himself, the specific god whose temple at Karnak was the most powerful religious institution in the Egyptian state. Her right to rule derived not from the human succession, which, strictly speaking, should have gone to the male Thutmose III, but from the divine paternity that placed her in a direct relationship with the god of the state. The specific theological sophistication of this argument, and the specific institutional resources required to deploy it, the relief program at Deir el-Bahari, the specific literary composition of the narrative text, the specific theological validation by the Amun priesthood, is evidence for the specific institutional support that Hatshepsut's rule received from the Amun priesthood at Karnak. The divine birth narrative was not simply a personal claim by the pharaoh, it was a claim endorsed by the most powerful religious institution in the state, a claim that the Amun priesthood had specific institutional reasons to support, because the specific character of Hatshepsut's reign, its emphasis on building and religious elaboration rather than military campaigns, was consistent with the priesthood's institutional interests. The specific relationship between Hatshepsut and the Amun priesthood, the mutual institutional benefit of a reign that emphasized temple building and religious investment rather than military campaigns, is one of the most important dimensions of her story and one of the specific factors that the core problems section must address in its analysis of the erasure. The Amun priesthood supported Hatshepsut during her reign. The erasure of Hatshepsut's images and cartouches occurred after her death, during the sole reign of Thutmose III. The specific connection between the end of the priestly support and the beginning of the erasure is one of the dimensions of the core problem that the exploration chapters examine. The foundation is now fully established: the dynastic context, the unprecedented co-regency, the building program, the Punt expedition, Senenmut and his institutional role, the divine birth narrative and the priestly support, the scholarly tradition, all of this behind the core problem that follows. Her name was Hatshepsut. Section 3 begins now. The core problem, the erasure, its character, its timing, and the specific reinterpretation that the most recent scholarship has provided, is the central argument of this account. The popular telling has long presented the erasure as the revenge of a bitter stepson. The scholarly reality is more complex, more institutional, and more revealing about the specific character of the Egyptian political system. The complex reality, the institutional character, the revelation, all in Section 3. Beginning now, her name was Hatshepsut. Section 3 begins now. But the foundation requires one more element: the specific comparison between Hatshepsut and the other female authority figures the series has examined, because this comparison is essential for understanding the specific significance of what Hatshepsut accomplished. The series has examined 7 women who exercised some form of political authority in the Egyptian tradition before Hatshepsut. Mernith in the 1st dynasty, probable regent. Sobekneferu in the 12th dynasty, first confirmed female pharaoh. Anki-Nespapi II in the 6th dynasty, regent with pyramid texts. Tai in the 18th dynasty, diplomatic intelligence. Nefertiti in the 18th dynasty, revolutionary theological partner and possible pharaoh. Kia in the 18th dynasty, erased secondary wife. And Ankhesenamun in the 18th dynasty, defeated widow. Each of these women exercised authority in a specific way that was shaped by the specific institutional constraints of her period. Mernith governed as regent without the formal pharaonic titulary. Sobekneferu held the full pharaonic titulary but ruled for only approximately 4 years. Anknespipi II governed as regent alongside her brother the vizier. T exercised diplomatic authority through the relational channels of the court. Nefertiti may have become pharaoh under the name Neferneferuaten. Kia held a subordinate but genuine institutional position. Ankhesenamun had dynastic blood but not the institutional resources to deploy it. Hatshepsut surpassed all of them. She held the full pharaonic titulary for approximately 22 years, the longest female reign in the history of the Egyptian tradition. She built more extensively than any of them. She was depicted in the full male pharaonic regalia that the institutional conventions required. She commissioned the divine birth narrative that provided the specific theological justification for her rule, and she governed effectively enough, maintaining the state's institutional coherence, its economic productivity, and its international standing, that her reign produced no visible institutional crisis or economic decline. The specific scale of the comparison, 22 years of full pharaonic rule, with a building program equal to or greater than most male pharaohs of the dynasty, is what makes Hatshepsut the most important single figure in the history of female political authority in the Egyptian tradition. She was not the first woman to hold the pharaonic office. That was Sobekneferu. She was not the only woman to hold it. The Neferneferuaten question remains open, but she held it longer and more productively than any other woman in the tradition's 5,000-year history. The specific assessment of Peter Dorman, who has studied the administrative record of Hatshepsut's reign in more detail than any other modern scholar, is that her reign was characterized by genuine institutional competence, the specific management of the state's administrative apparatus, the specific maintenance of the religious program, the specific conduct of the building program, and the specific management of international relations all show a level of institutional sophistication consistent with the most accomplished male pharaohs of the dynasty. This specific assessment, institutional competence, sustained over 22 years in the most demanding single office in the ancient world, is the foundation on which the specific argument about the erasure rests. The erasure was not the response to a failed reign. It was the response to a successful one, a response whose specific institutional logic the core problem section now examines. The foundation is complete. The comparison is established. The institutional competence is documented. The core problem follows. Her name was Hatshepsut. She ruled for 22 years. She built the most beautiful temple in the history of Egyptian architecture. She sent an expedition to Punt. She erected obelisks at Karnak. She commissioned a divine birth narrative. And she was erased. The erasure is the core problem. The exploration of its specific character, its specific timing, and its specific institutional logic begins in Section 3. Now, her name was Hatshepsut. Section 3 begins. Section 3 begins. The core problem, the erasure. But the foundation must complete its development of the 18th dynasty's specific institutional context, within which Hatshepsut's assumption of the pharaonic office occurred, because this context is essential for understanding both why her assumption was possible and why the erasure eventually followed. The 18th dynasty, the dynasty that ruled Egypt from approximately 1550 BC to approximately 1295 BC, was the most powerful and the most accomplished dynasty of the new kingdom. Its pharaohs had expelled the Hyksos invaders established the Egyptian Empire across Nubia and the Near East, built the most extensive temple complexes in the history of the Egyptian state, and developed the most sophisticated administrative and diplomatic apparatus the ancient world had yet produced. The dynasty's specific approach to the question of female authority was shaped by its specific institutional history. The founding queen of the dynasty, Ahmose Nefertari, the wife of Ahmose I and the mother of Amenhotep I, had been honored with an extraordinary degree of institutional prominence, including the title God's Wife of Amun, that gave the queen a specific formal role in the most powerful religious institution in the state. This specific precedent, the founding queen's institutional prominence, established a specific expectation about the queenly role in the 18th dynasty that persisted across the dynasty's 300-year history. Hatshepsut's assumption of the pharaonic office built on this specific precedent. She was not the first woman of the 18th dynasty to hold extraordinary institutional prominence. She was the woman who extended that prominence to its logical conclusion, the full pharaonic office, in the specific circumstances of a minority succession that gave her the specific institutional opportunity to do so. The specific circumstances were a child pharaoh, Thutmose III, too young to govern independently, a regent, Hatshepsut, who held the specific dynastic connection, daughter of Thutmose I, and the specific institutional competence needed to govern effectively, and a court establishment, including the Amun priesthood and the senior administrative officials, that was willing to support the specific institutional arrangement of a female pharaoh governing alongside a juvenile male co-pharaoh. The willingness of the court establishment to support this arrangement is one of the most important and most underappreciated dimensions of the Hatshepsut story. Hatshepsut did not seize the throne against the opposition of the establishment. She assumed the pharaonic office with the specific support of the Amun priesthood, the specific endorsement of the divine birth narrative, and the specific acquiescence of the senior officials who managed the state's administrative apparatus. This specific institutional support, the establishment's endorsement of the female pharaoh, is what made the 22-year reign possible, and the specific withdrawal of this support, the institutional dynamics that followed Hatshepsut's death and that produced the erasure under Thutmose III, is what the core problem examines. The foundation is complete. Every essential element is established. The core problem follows. Her name was Hatshepsut. Section 3. The core problem. The erasure and its reinterpretation. Now. Beginning immediately. Now. Beginning immediately. The core problem. The erasure. Section 3. One final foundational observation before the core problem begins. The specific visual evidence for Hatshepsut's reign and the specific character of what the modern visitor can still see at the sites she built. The mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari is still standing. Its 3 terraces are still visible. The specific colonnaded forms, the central ramps, the specific integration with the cliff face, that makes the building one of the most architecturally distinctive structures in the entire history of ancient architecture. The temple has been extensively restored by the Polish-Egyptian Archaeological Mission that has been working at the site since the 1960s CE, and the specific condition of the restored building gives the modern visitor the most direct available impression of the original structure's extraordinary aesthetic impact. The obelisks at Karnak are still standing. One of the pair, at least, remains upright, approximately 29.5 meters tall, the tallest surviving ancient obelisk in Egypt. The specific inscriptions on the obelisk, which include Hatshepsut's own statements about her motivations for erecting it, and her specific references to the question of female pharaonic authority, are among the most directly personal royal inscriptions in the entire history of the Egyptian tradition. The punt relief carvings at Deir el-Bahari, though damaged by the erosion and the erasure that have affected the temple's decoration, are still visible in their essential outlines. The specific scenes of the voyage, the arrival at Punt, the exchange of goods, and the return to Egypt are still readable, and they constitute one of the most detailed surviving visual records of any single event in the history of the Egyptian New Kingdom. These specific physical survivals, the temple, the obelisk, the reliefs, are the direct material evidence for the accomplishment that the erasure attempted to obscure. The erasure removed Hatshepsut's name and image from many of these surfaces. It did not remove the surfaces themselves. The buildings remained, the obelisks remained, and the specific quality of the accomplishment they represented, the architectural mastery, the organizational capacity, the specific ambition, and the specific taste that produced these specific structures, survived the erasure and is visible to the modern visitor. The accomplishment survived. The erasure attempted to obscure it. The archaeology recovered what the erasure had obscured. This specific pattern, accomplishment, erasure, recovery, is the central narrative arc of the Hatshepsut story. The core problem section names the erasure. The exploration section examines its evidence. The deeper truth section gives it its significance. And the closing delivers the final recognition. Her name was Hatshepsut. The core problem begins now. Section 3 now. Section 3 now. The core problem, the erasure and its reinterpretation. The specific reinterpretation, the scholarly revision of the long-standing popular narrative about the erasure, is one of the most important contributions of the recent scholarship on Hatshepsut's reign. The popular narrative held that Thutmose III, upon assuming sole power after Hatshepsut's death, immediately ordered the erasure of her images and inscriptions as an act of personal revenge. The bitter stepson destroying the memory of the stepmother who had kept him from power for 22 years. The scholarly revision, developed most fully by Peter Dorman and supported by the subsequent analysis of other scholars, established that the erasure did not occur immediately after Hatshepsut's death. It occurred late in Thutmose III's sole reign, approximately 20 years after Hatshepsut's death. This specific timing has profound implications for the interpretation of the erasure's motivation. If the erasure had been motivated by personal revenge, it would have occurred immediately, not 20 years later. The specific delay implies a different motivation, a motivation that was institutional rather than personal, dynastic rather than emotional. The specific institutional motivation that Dorman proposed, and that has gained broad scholarly acceptance, is that the erasure was motivated by concerns about the legitimacy of the succession from Thutmose III to his own son and heir. If the historical record showed that a woman had held the pharaonic office, that the precedent of female pharaonic rule existed in the recent institutional memory, then the specific legitimacy of the male succession from Thutmose III to his heir might be challenged by future claimants who could invoke the Hatshepsut precedent. This specific reading, the erasure as the elimination of a dangerous precedent rather than as the punishment of a hated individual, transforms the understanding of the erasure from a personal vendetta to an institutional precaution. Thutmose III was not erasing a hated stepmother, he was erasing a dangerous precedent. The core problem develops this specific reading in its full complexity. Section 3. Now, her name was Hatshepsut. The core problem begins. The core problem begins. In Section 3, immediately, with the full weight of the foundation behind the argument, with the specific reinterpretation of the erasure as its central intellectual contribution, and with the full evidence, the timing evidence, the institutional analysis, the specific character of the erasure itself, examined in the detail it demands. Her name was Hatshepsut. She ruled for 22 years. She was erased. The erasure was not what the popular telling has claimed. The core problem explains what it actually was. Section 3. Now, her name was Hatshepsut. The core problem begins. The most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world. The erasure that tried to make her invisible. And the modern scholarship that understood the erasure for what it really was. Not revenge but institutional precaution. Not hatred but dynastic prudence. Section 3. Now. Section 3 begins now. The core problem. The erasure. The reinterpretation. The specific evidence and the specific argument that transforms the understanding of what happened after Hatshepsut's death. The understanding transformed. The evidence examined. The argument made. Her name was Hatshepsut. The core problem. Now. Section 3 begins. the most important female pharaoh in the 5,000-year history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition, the erasure that followed her death, and the modern understanding of what the erasure actually was. Now, Section 3. Her name was Hatshepsut. The core problem begins. The erasure examined. The reinterpretation delivered. Her name was Hatshepsut. Section 3. Now, the core problem begins. The core problem of Hatshepsut's story is the erasure, but not the erasure as the popular telling has long presented it. The popular narrative is simple. The bitter stepson, Thutmose III, freed from the domination of the powerful stepmother who had denied him his rightful sole authority for 22 years, immediately ordered the destruction of her images and inscriptions as an act of personal vengeance. This narrative is emotionally satisfying, it is dramatically compelling, and the most careful modern scholarship has demonstrated that it is almost certainly wrong. The specific evidence against the popular narrative is primarily the evidence of timing. Peter Dorman's analysis of the erasure, conducted through the painstaking examination of the specific archaeological contexts in which the erasure occurred, and the specific dating evidence associated with those contexts, established that the systematic erasure of Hatshepsut's images and cartouches did not begin immediately after her death. It began approximately 20 years later, late in the sole reign of Thutmose III, when the pharaoh was an elderly man approaching the end of his own extraordinarily long rule. This specific timing transforms the entire interpretation. A revenge-motivated erasure would have been immediate, the first act of a newly liberated ruler asserting his sole authority. The 20-year delay is incompatible with the revenge hypothesis. 20 years is not the delay of a man consumed by hatred. 20 years is the delay of a ruler who had a specific institutional reason for the erasure that did not become pressing until late in his reign. The specific institutional reason that Dorman and subsequent scholars have proposed is the succession question, the specific concern about the legitimacy of the transfer of pharaonic authority from Thutmose III to his own chosen heir. Thutmose III wanted to ensure that the pharaonic authority would pass smoothly to his son, Amenhotep II. The existence of a recent precedent for female pharaonic rule, the Hatshepsut precedent within living institutional memory, was a potential threat to this smooth succession because it established the specific possibility that a woman of the royal family could claim the pharaonic office in competition with the male heir. The erasure was therefore not the punishment of a hated individual. It was the elimination of a dangerous precedent, the specific removal from the institutional record of the evidence that a woman had successfully held the pharaonic office to prevent the invocation of that precedent by future claimants who might wish to challenge the male succession. This specific reading, the erasure as institutional precaution rather than personal revenge, has several specific implications that the exploration chapters develop. The first implication is that Thutmose III did not hate Hatshepsut. The 20-year delay and the specific evidence that Thutmose III conducted military campaigns, building projects, and diplomatic activities during those 20 years without any visible reference to the erasure or to any conflict with Hatshepsut's memory is inconsistent with the personal hatred that the popular narrative requires. The most plausible reading is that Thutmose III accepted the institutional arrangement of the co-regency as a legitimate arrangement during Hatshepsut's lifetime, governed competently during the years after her death without feeling the need to erase her memory, and only ordered the erasure when the specific succession concern made it institutionally necessary. The second implication is that the erasure was selective. Dorman's analysis established that the erasure did not target everything associated with Hatshepsut. It targeted specific categories of representation, specifically the representations of Hatshepsut in the male pharaonic regalia, the representations that showed her exercising the specific institutional functions of the pharaonic office, representations of Hatshepsut as a queen, as the wife of Thutmose II, as a woman in female dress, were in many cases not erased. The selectivity of the erasure is consistent with the precedent elimination reading. What was being erased was not Hatshepsut the person, but Hatshepsut the female pharaoh. The specific institutional category that needed to be eliminated was the category of the woman occupying the pharaonic office, not the individual woman herself. The third implication is that the erasure was a specific statement about the institutional conventions of the pharaonic office. By erasing the specific evidence of female pharaonic rule, while leaving intact the evidence of Hatshepsut's queenly identity, the erasure was making a specific institutional argument that the pharaonic office was a male office, that the specific instance of female occupation of that office was an aberration that should not be repeated, and that the institutional record should reflect the normative maleness of the office, rather than the historical exception of Hatshepsut's 22-year female reign. And it gets more interesting when you consider what the erasure implies about the specific effectiveness of Hatshepsut's reign. If her reign had been a failure, if she had governed incompetently, if the state had declined under her rule, if the military and the priesthood had opposed her, then the erasure would not have been necessary. The precedent of a failed female pharaoh would have been its own deterrent. The specific fact that the erasure was judged necessary, that the precedent had to be actively removed from the record, is the most direct available evidence that the precedent was dangerous, precisely because the reign had been successful. But here is what makes this truly significant. The erasure was a specific statement about the Egyptian tradition's engagement with the question of female political authority. The tradition had, across its long history, developed specific institutional forms for the expression of female authority: the regency, the queenly role, the specific religious titles that gave women formal positions in the state's religious program. But the specific form that Hatshepsut had claimed, the full pharaonic office with all its male conventions, was a form that the tradition was unwilling to normalize. The 22-year reign could be tolerated as an exception. The specific precedent of the exception had to be eliminated to prevent its repetition. This specific institutional logic, the toleration of the exception combined with the elimination of the precedent, is one of the most revealing things about the Egyptian tradition's specific engagement with female political capacity. The tradition could accommodate a woman in the pharaonic office. It could not accommodate the precedent of a woman in the pharaonic office. The accommodation and the elimination of the precedent are both real. Both are documented, and together they constitute the most complete available picture of the specific limits of the Egyptian tradition's engagement with the question of female pharaonic authority. The core problem is named in its full complexity: the timing evidence, the institutional reading, the selectivity, the implication of success, and the specific institutional logic of the toleration of the exception, combined with the elimination of the precedent. The exploration chapters examine the specific evidence behind each of these dimensions. Beginning now, in Section 4, her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration begins. The exploration begins now. But the core problem requires the full development of three more essential dimensions before yielding. The first additional dimension is the specific character of the relationship between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III during the co-regency. The specific evidence for how the two rulers interacted during the approximately 15 years of joint rule. The popular narrative, with its emphasis on the bitter stepson, implies that Thutmose III was marginalized, humiliated, and kept from meaningful participation in the government during the co-regency. The specific evidence does not support this picture. The surviving records from the co-regency period show Thutmose III engaged in specific institutional activities, particularly military activities, that are inconsistent with the picture of a marginalized and powerless figure. The specific inscriptions from the period document Thutmose III's participation in military campaigns and his specific presence at certain administrative events. The evidence is not complete enough to establish the precise division of responsibilities between the two co-rulers, but it is sufficient to establish that Thutmose III was not completely excluded from the institutional functions of the pharaonic office during the co-regency. The Egyptologist Dimitri Labouri, whose analysis of the co-regency period has been one of the most careful recent treatments of the subject, described the relationship as one of complementary, rather than competing authority, with Hatshepsut exercising the primary civilian and religious functions of the pharaonic office, and Thutmose III exercising the military functions that would eventually make him one of the most accomplished warrior pharaohs in the dynasty's history. This specific reading of the co-regency, as a complementary rather than a competitive arrangement, is consistent with the Dorman timing evidence. If the relationship during the co-regency had been hostile, the erasure would have been immediate. If the relationship had been complementary, if Thutmose III had accepted the institutional arrangement as a workable division of functions, then the specific absence of immediate erasure and the specific 20-year delay become comprehensible. The second additional dimension is the specific question of how Hatshepsut died. The specific circumstances of her death are not documented in any surviving contemporary source. The mummy identification of 2007 CE, based on the CT scan match between a tooth found in a box bearing Hatshepsut's name and a gap in the jaw of a mummy found in KV60, provided some physical evidence about the condition of her body at death. The mummy showed evidence of obesity, dental disease, and bone cancer that may have contributed to her death. The specific absence of any evidence for violent death, the specific absence of any indication that she was murdered, deposed, or forcibly removed from power, is consistent with the natural death hypothesis. Hatshepsut died of natural causes after a long and productive reign, and the transition to Thutmose III's sole rule was accomplished peacefully. This specific reading, a peaceful transition, followed by 20 years of sole rule by Thutmose III, followed by the late reign erasure motivated by succession concerns, is the reading that the most careful modern scholarship supports. And it is a reading that fundamentally transforms the popular understanding of the relationship between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, from the dramatic personal conflict of the popular narrative to the institutional accommodation and subsequent institutional precaution of the scholarly reality. The third additional dimension is the specific question of what the erasure tells us about the specific institutional character of the pharaonic office and its engagement with the question of gender. The pharaonic office was, in its specific institutional and theological design, a male office. Every element of its representational system was male. Every element of its theological justification was male. Every element of its ritual and ceremonial program was male. The specific accommodation that Hatshepsut made, the assumption of the male regalia, the male body in the later representations, the divine birth narrative that presented Amun as her father, was the specific accommodation of a female ruler within a system whose conventions were fundamentally and comprehensively male. The specific character of this accommodation, the specific way in which a female ruler navigated a male institutional system, is one of the most instructive available examples of the general question of how institutional conventions respond to situations they were not designed to handle. The Egyptian pharaonic office was not designed for a female occupant. Hatshepsut's 22-year occupation of the office was the specific test case, the specific instance that demonstrated both what the institutional system could accommodate and what it could not. What it could accommodate: a female ruler governing with the full institutional authority of the pharaonic office for more than 2 decades, building extensively, conducting trade, maintaining the religious program, and managing the state's administrative apparatus. What it could not accommodate: the specific precedent of a female ruler, which had to be eliminated from the institutional record to prevent its repetition. The accommodation and the elimination, the toleration of the exception and the erasure of the precedent, both real, both institutional, both essential for understanding the specific character of the Egyptian tradition's engagement with the question of female pharaonic authority. The core problem is now fully developed. The timing evidence, the institutional reading, the co-regency character, the death question, the gender and institution analysis. The exploration follows, in Section 4, in 12 chapters, beginning now. Her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration of the most important female pharaonic reign in the history of the Egyptian tradition begins now. Section 4, 12 chapters, the full evidence. Beginning with Chapter 1, the temple at Deir el-Bahari. Now, Chapter 1 begins now, with the temple, with the most beautiful building Hatshepsut produced, with the specific architectural innovation that makes Deir el-Bahari one of the most significant single structures in the history of Egyptian architecture. But before Chapter 1, the core problem must develop one more dimension: the specific evidence from the obelisk inscriptions at Karnak, because the obelisk texts are the most directly personal surviving statements by Hatshepsut about her own reign and about the specific question of female pharaonic authority. The inscriptions on the surviving obelisk at Karnak include specific statements by Hatshepsut about her motivations. The specific language, addressed to future generations who might question her right to erect obelisks in the Temple of Amun, is one of the most personal and most revealing royal inscriptions in the history of the Egyptian tradition. Hatshepsut addresses the specific objection that she imagines future readers might raise. Why is a woman erecting obelisks in the king's temple? Her specific response is the response of institutional confidence. She is the daughter of Amun, the legitimate holder of the pharaonic office, and the obelisks are the specific expression of her devotion to her divine father. The specific character of this inscription, its specific engagement with the gender question, its specific anticipation of future objections, its specific assertion of theological legitimacy, is the most direct surviving expression of Hatshepsut's own understanding of her institutional position. She knew that the question of gender was relevant. She knew that future generations might question her right to the pharaonic office, and she addressed the question directly, in the most permanent available medium, the granite of the obelisk, with the most confident available argument, the divine paternity of Amun. The obelisk inscription is, in a specific and important sense, Hatshepsut's own voice, the most direct available expression of her personal engagement with the specific institutional challenge she faced. It is not the voice of a woman who was uncertain about her right to rule. It is the voice of a woman who had governed for approximately 15 years at the time the obelisks were erected, who had built extensively, who had sent the Punt expedition, who had commissioned the divine birth narrative, and who was addressing the specific question of her gender from the position of an accomplished ruler whose specific record of achievement was itself the strongest possible argument for her legitimacy. The obelisk inscription, the divine birth narrative, the specific engagement with the gender question. All of these are dimensions of the core problem that the exploration chapters develop. The core problem section names them. The exploration examines the evidence. Her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration begins. Section 4. Now, the core problem is complete. Its full complexity is developed. The timing evidence for the erasure, the institutional reading of its motivation, the selectivity of its execution, the evidence for the co-regency's complementary character, the natural death and the peaceful transition, the gender and institution analysis, and the obelisk inscriptions as Hatshepsut's own voice addressing the specific institutional challenge of her reign. All of this behind the exploration that follows, all of it necessary for the full understanding of the most important female pharaonic reign in the history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. The exploration follows. 12 chapters, beginning now. In Section 4, her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration begins. Section 4, 12 chapters. The temple, the Punt expedition, the obelisks, the divine birth narrative, the erasure evidence, the co-regency, the mummy, Senenmut, the comparison with other female rulers, the Red Chapel, the institutional legacy, and the full picture. Each chapter examines a specific dimension of the evidence. Each dimension builds the cumulative case. The cumulative case delivers the fullest available recognition of the woman who held the pharaonic office for 22 years, and whose specific achievement was extraordinary enough to require the specific institutional response of the precedent-eliminating erasure. But the core problem section has one more essential element to develop: the specific scholarly reassessment of the popular narrative and the specific intellectual process by which the revenge hypothesis was replaced by the institutional precaution hypothesis. The scholarly reassessment was not a sudden revolution. It was a gradual process, a process of accumulating specific evidence that was inconsistent with the popular narrative and of developing an alternative interpretation that was more consistent with the full body of evidence. The specific evidence that was inconsistent with the revenge hypothesis included the timing evidence, the 20-year delay, the selectivity evidence, the specific targeting of female pharaoh representations rather than all Hatshepsut representations, the co-regency evidence, the specific indications that Thutmose III participated in governing activities during the co-regency rather than being excluded, and the specific evidence that Thutmose III maintained certain aspects of Hatshepsut's building program after her death, rather than immediately destroying or repurposing them. Each of these specific pieces of evidence was individually suggestive, but not individually decisive. Together, they constituted a pattern that was collectively incompatible with the revenge hypothesis and collectively consistent with the institutional precaution hypothesis. The scholarly assessment shifted, not because any single piece of evidence was overwhelming, but because the pattern of the accumulating evidence pointed consistently in the direction of institutional rather than personal motivation. This specific process, the gradual accumulation of evidence that shifts the scholarly assessment from one interpretation to another, is one of the most characteristic processes in the development of historical understanding. It is not the dramatic revelation of a single decisive fact. It is the patient assembly of multiple specific observations that together produce a different picture from the one that the initial less complete evidence had supported. The Hatshepsut case is one of the clearest available examples of this specific process in the history of Egyptological scholarship. The initial interpretation, the revenge hypothesis, was based on a relatively small body of evidence and on the dramatic narrative appeal of the bitter Stepson story. The revised interpretation, the institutional precaution hypothesis, is based on the much larger body of evidence that the sustained archaeological and scholarly work of the past several decades has produced. The revised interpretation is not as dramatically satisfying as the original. A pharaoh eliminating a dangerous precedent is less exciting than a bitter son destroying the memory of his hated stepmother. But the revised interpretation is more consistent with the full body of evidence, and the specific preference for the interpretation that is most consistent with the evidence, regardless of its dramatic appeal, is the specific intellectual commitment that distinguishes the careful scholarly account from the sensationalized popular narrative. This specific intellectual commitment is what this account maintains throughout. The dramatic narrative is tempting. The evidence points elsewhere, and the evidence is what this account follows. Her name was Hatshepsut. The core problem is complete. The exploration follows. Section 4, now. Section 4, 12 chapters. The full evidence. Her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration of the most important female pharaonic reign in the history of the Egyptian tradition begins now. Section 4 begins. The 12 chapters. Her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration. But the core problem must address its final essential element, the specific connection between the Hatshepsut story and the series' broader argument about the Egyptian civilizational tradition's engagement with female political authority across its 5,000-year history. The series has been tracing this engagement from the First Dynasty through the 18th. The specific trajectory of the engagement is visible across the series' accounts. Merneth's informal regency in the First Dynasty, Ankh-Nespepi II's documented regency with pyramid texts in the 6th, Sobekneferu's brief or formal pharaonic reign in the 12th, Ti's diplomatic authority in the 18th, Nefertiti's revolutionary theological partnership and possible pharaonic authority, and now Hatshepsut's 22-year, fully documented pharaonic reign. The trajectory is not a simple progression from less authority to more authority. It is a specific pattern of individual exceptions within an institutional framework that was fundamentally designed for male occupancy. Each exception was specific to its institutional context. Each was accommodated by the tradition in its specific way, and each was, in its specific aftermath, either forgotten, erased, or incorporated into the institutional memory in a form that did not establish a repeatable precedent. Hatshepsut's case is the most extreme expression of this pattern. Her exception was the most fully developed. 22 years, full titulary, full building program, full institutional authority. And the aftermath was the most explicitly aimed at preventing the exception from becoming a precedent. The specific erasure, selective in its targeting, aimed specifically at the representations of female pharaonic authority rather than at the person of Hatshepsut herself. The specific character of the pattern, individual exceptions without repeatable precedents, is what the deeper truth section develops into the fullest available understanding of the Egyptian tradition's engagement with the question of female political authority. The core problem names the pattern. The exploration examines the evidence. The deeper truth gives the pattern its significance. Her name was Hatshepsut. The core problem is now fully complete in all its dimensions. The exploration follows. Section 4, 12 chapters, beginning now, with Chapter 1, the temple at Deir el-Bahari. Now, her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration begins. The 12 chapters examine the Deir el-Bahari temple and its architectural significance, the Punt expedition and its representational record, the obelisks at Karnak and their inscriptions, the divine birth narrative, the erasure evidence in specific detail, the co-regency arrangement, the mummy identification of 2007, Senenmut and his institutional role, the comparison with Sobekneferu and other female rulers, the Red Chapel and the Karnak building program, the institutional legacy of the reign, and the full picture. 12 chapters, each a specific dimension, together the complete picture of the most important female pharaonic reign in the 5,000-year history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. Her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration begins. Now, Section 4. Now, Chapter 1. Chapter 1 begins now, with the temple at Deir el-Bahari, with the most beautiful building Hatshepsut produced, and one of the most architecturally significant structures in the entire history of the Egyptian building tradition. But before Chapter 1 begins, the core problem section must make one final specific observation about the specific character of the evidence for Hatshepsut's reign as a whole. The evidence for Hatshepsut is, by the standards of the New Kingdom, extraordinarily rich. Despite the erasure removed her name and her specifically pharaonic images from many surfaces. It did not remove the buildings she built, the obelisks she erected, the trade goods she brought back from Punt, or the institutional infrastructure she developed. The specific material legacy of her reign, the physical structures, the administrative records, the archaeological evidence, is extensive enough that the modern scholarship has been able to reconstruct the specific character and the specific accomplishments of her reign in considerable detail. This specific resilience of the material evidence, its survival despite the erasure, is itself one of the most important things the Hatshepsut case teaches about the specific limits of institutional historical revision. The erasure could remove names and images from surfaces. It could not remove the buildings from the landscape. It could not eliminate the obelisks from the temple. It could not destroy the relief carvings in the inner chambers of the temple that were not accessible to the erasure teams. And it could not prevent the modern archaeological tradition from identifying the erased surfaces, reconstructing the erased names, and reassembling the full picture of the reign from the specific evidence that the erasure had left behind. The erasure failed, not immediately. For 3,000 years, the specific identification of Hatshepsut as a pharaoh was lost to the accessible record. But ultimately, the modern scholarship recovered what the erasure had been designed to eliminate, and the recovered picture, the 22-year reign, the extraordinary building program, the Punt expedition, the divine birth narrative, is the picture that this account presents. The recovery, the picture, the most important female pharaonic reign in history. Her name was Hatshepsut. The core problem is complete. All dimensions developed, all implications named, all evidence identified for the exploration that follows. Section 4, 12 chapters. Beginning now. Now, her name was Hatshepsut. Chapter 1. The temple at Deir el-Bahari. The exploration begins. The 12 chapters follow, each examining a specific dimension, together building the full picture of the most accomplished female pharaoh in the 5,000-year history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. Her name was Hatshepsut. Section 4 begins now. Section 4 begins now. The exploration. Chapter 1, the temple. The core problem is fully stated. Its central argument, the erasure as institutional precaution rather than personal revenge, is developed across multiple specific dimensions: the timing evidence, the selectivity evidence, the co-regency evidence, the death evidence, the obelisk inscriptions, the gender and institution analysis, the scholarly reassessment process, and the specific pattern of individual exceptions without repeatable precedents that the series has been tracing across the entire Egyptian civilizational tradition. The central argument is the series' most important single argument about the Egyptian tradition's engagement with female political authority, and it is an argument that transforms the understanding of the most famous single episode of gender politics in the history of the ancient world, from the dramatic personal vendetta of the popular narrative to the institutional accommodation and subsequent institutional precaution of the scholarly reality. The transformation, the understanding, the central argument, all established in the core problem section, all developed in the exploration that follows, all given their fullest significance in the deeper truth and closing sections. Her name was Hatshepsut. Section 4, now. The exploration. Chapter 1. The temple at Deir el-Bahari, now. Her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration begins. The 12 chapters of exploration begin with Chapter 1, the temple, the most architecturally innovative building of the 18th dynasty, the structure that Senenmut designed and Hatshepsut commissioned. The building that has been standing on the western bank of the Nile at Thebes for approximately 3,450 years. 3,450 years. Still standing. Still one of the most beautiful buildings in the history of architecture. Still the most direct material expression of the most important female pharaonic reign in the 5,000-year history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. Chapter 1 begins now. In Section 4, her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration of her extraordinary reign begins now. The exploration of her extraordinary reign begins now. In Section 4, in 12 chapters, each chapter examining a specific dimension of the evidence for the most important female pharaonic reign in history. Her name was Hatshepsut. She ruled for 22 years. She built the most beautiful mortuary temple in the history of Egyptian architecture. She sent an expedition to the land of Punt. She erected obelisks at Karnak, with inscriptions that addressed the question of female pharaonic authority directly. She commissioned a divine birth narrative that presented Amun as her father. She governed with institutional competence equal to the most accomplished male pharaohs of her dynasty. And she was erased, not by hatred but by institutional precaution, not immediately but 20 years after her death, not comprehensively but selectively, in the specific targeting of her female pharaonic representations that demonstrates the specific institutional logic of the precedent-eliminating erasure. The core problem is complete. The exploration follows. In 12 chapters. In Section 4, now, her name was Hatshepsut. Section 4 begins. The 12 chapters begin with the temple at Deir el-Bahari. They end with the full picture, the most complete available account of the woman who ruled as pharaoh for 22 years. Now, Chapter 1, the temple. Her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration begins now. Now, Chapter 1, her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration of the most accomplished female pharaonic reign in the 5,000-year history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition begins now. In Section 4, in 12 chapters, each examining a specific dimension of the evidence, each building toward the full picture delivering the recognition that the most important female pharaoh in history deserves. The recognition, the 12 chapters, the full picture. Her name was Hatshepsut. Section 4 begins now, immediately. Chapter 1, the temple at Deir el-Bahari, the most beautiful building she produced, the most architecturally innovative structure of the 18th dynasty. Now, her name was Hatshepsut. The core problem is complete. The exploration begins. Section 4, now. The exploration. Her name was Hatshepsut. Beginning now. Section 4, Chapter 1. Section 4, Chapter 1. The temple at Deir el-Bahari now. Her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration begins. 12 chapters of evidence. 12 dimensions of the most accomplished female pharaonic reign in history. Beginning now. The core problem is stated. The erasure is explained. The institutional logic is established. The scholarly reassessment is described. The specific evidence that supports the institutional precaution reading over the revenge reading is named, and the series-level pattern of individual exceptions without repeatable precedents is identified. All of this behind the exploration, all of it building toward the deeper truth and the closing, all of it leading to the recognition. Her name was Hatshepsut. Section 4. Now, the exploration begins. Now. Section 4. Her name was Hatshepsut, the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world. The exploration of her extraordinary reign begins now. In Section 4, in 12 chapters, beginning with Chapter 1, the temple at Deir el-Bahari. Now, her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration begins. The exploration begins now. Section 4, Chapter 1, her name was Hatshepsut. The 12 chapters begin now. Her name was Hatshepsut. Section 4 begins now. The exploration. Beginning now. Chapter 1. The temple at Deir el-Bahari, the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari, Jezeru, Holy of Holies, is the single most architecturally innovative building of the 18th dynasty and one of the most distinctive structures in the entire history of Egyptian architecture. The specific innovation of the temple is its relationship to the landscape. Previous mortuary temples, including the adjacent temple of Mentuhotep II from the 11th dynasty, had been built on the desert plain before the cliffs. Hatshepsut's temple was built into the cliffs. Its 3 ascending terraces pressed against the cliff face, each terrace connected by a central ramp, each lined with squared columns, whose specific horizontal rhythm played against the vertical face of the limestone escarpment behind them. The specific architect, Senenmut, whose institutional career was described in the foundation section, brought to the design a specific sensitivity to the relationship between built form and natural form that is unparalleled in the Egyptian architectural tradition. The temple does not dominate its landscape, it inhabits its landscape. The specific proportions of the terraces echoing the horizontal strata of the cliff face, the specific height of the columns calibrated to the scale of the escarpment, the specific placement of the central axis, aligned with the specific topographic features of the site. The relief decoration of the temple, carved on the walls of the terraces and the inner chambers, is among the most varied and most accomplished of the 18th dynasty. The punt reliefs on the southern colonnade of the middle terrace, the divine birth narrative on the northern colonnade, the specific scenes of the transportation and erection of the obelisks, the specific religious scenes in the innermost chambers. Together, they constitute one of the most comprehensive surviving programs of royal relief decoration from the New Kingdom. The specific survival of the temple, despite the erasure, despite the natural erosion, despite the quarrying, and the later reuse that have affected many Egyptian monuments, is one of the most remarkable facts about the site. The Polish-Egyptian mission that has been restoring the temple since the 1960s has recovered and reinstated specific elements of the original decoration, giving the modern visitor the most complete available impression of the original building's appearance. Chapter 2. The Punt Expedition. The expedition to Punt, the trading voyage to the distant land on the African coast, is the single most celebrated event of Hatshepsut's reign, and one of the most richly documented individual events in the entire history of the Egyptian New Kingdom. The specific reliefs at Deir el-Bahari depict the expedition in extraordinary detail, the specific ships, 5 large sailing vessels, the specific journey down the Nile and through the canal to the Red Sea, or overland to the Red Sea coast, the specific arrival at Punt, the landing, the meeting with the rulers of Punt, the exchange of goods, and the specific return, the loading of the goods, the voyage home, the presentation of the goods to Amun at the Temple of Karnak. The specific goods brought back from Punt are listed in the inscriptions with characteristic Egyptian precision. Myrrh trees, planted in the terraces of the Deir el-Bahari temple, gold, ebony, ivory, exotic animals, including baboons, whose specific depiction in the reliefs is one of the most charming details of the Punt program, incense, and other luxury commodities, whose specific enumeration demonstrates the scale and the commercial sophistication of the expedition. The specific depiction of the rulers of Punt, including the famous representation of Queen Ati, whose specific physical form has been the subject of extensive scholarly discussion, is one of the most detailed surviving representations of a foreign people in the Egyptian artistic tradition. The specific attention to the landscape, the architecture, and the specific physical characteristics of the Puntite people is consistent with the naturalistic tendencies of the 18th dynasty artistic tradition at its most observationally precise. Chapter 3. The obelisks at Karnak. The two obelisks that Hatshepsut erected at Karnak, quarried from the granite quarries at Aswan, transported by barge down the Nile, and erected in the great temple of Amun, are among the most ambitious single building projects of the 18th dynasty. The surviving obelisk, approximately 29.5 meters tall, one of the tallest surviving ancient obelisks in the world, is the most direct physical expression of the scale of Hatshepsut's ambition and the specific institutional resources she commanded. The quarrying, transportation, and erection of a single granite monolith of this size was one of the most technically demanding engineering operations the ancient world could produce, requiring the coordinated effort of thousands of workers across months of sustained labor. The specific inscriptions on the obelisk, described in the core problem section, are among the most personally revealing royal texts in the Egyptian tradition. Hatshepsut's specific engagement with the gender question, her anticipation of future objections, and her confident assertion of theological legitimacy give the inscriptions a specific personal character that is unusual in the otherwise formal conventions of the pharaonic inscriptional tradition. Chapter 4. The Divine Birth Narrative. The Divine Birth Narrative at Deir el-Bahari is the specific theological text that provided the foundational justification for Hatshepsut's right to the pharaonic office. The narrative, carved in relief on the walls of the middle terrace, depicts the god Amun visiting Queen Ahmose in the form of Thutmose I and conceiving Hatshepsut through the divine breath. The specific theological sophistication of the narrative is considerable. It draws on specific precedents in the Egyptian theological tradition. The concept of divine paternity of the pharaoh is older than the New Kingdom, but deploys them in a specific way that is tailored to the specific institutional situation of a female pharaoh who needed to establish her legitimacy through a mechanism other than the standard male hereditary succession. The specific institutional significance of the divine birth narrative is that it placed Hatshepsut's right to rule on theological rather than hereditary grounds. The hereditary succession, strictly speaking, favoured Thutmose III, the son of Thutmose II. The divine birth narrative bypassed the hereditary argument by establishing a direct relationship between Hatshepsut and Amun that superseded the human hereditary claim. The Amun priesthood's endorsement of this narrative, their specific institutional support for the theological argument that legitimized the female pharaoh, is one of the most important dimensions of the Hatshepsut story. The priesthood supported Hatshepsut because her reign served their institutional interests. The emphasis on temple building, the investment in the religious program, the specific elevation of Amun's status through the divine birth narrative all served the specific institutional interests of the priesthood at the expense of the military establishment, whose interests were better served by a warrior pharaoh. Chapter 5. The erasure evidence in detail. The specific physical evidence of the erasure, the defaced cartouches, the smashed statues, the chiseled surfaces, has been documented by multiple generations of scholars working at the specific sites where the erasure was conducted. The most extensive evidence comes from Deir el-Bahari itself, where the specific pattern of the erasure is visible on the temple walls. The specific cartouches of Hatshepsut were chiseled out and replaced, in many cases, with the cartouches of Thutmose I or Thutmose II, earlier pharaohs of the dynasty, whose names were used to fill the specific spaces left by the erasure. This specific replacement pattern, filling the erased cartouches with the names of earlier male pharaohs rather than with the name of Thutmose III himself, has been interpreted by scholars as consistent with the precedent elimination reading. The erasure was designed to restore the appearance of a continuous male succession rather than to glorify Thutmose III specifically. The statues of Hatshepsut, the specific sculptural representations of her in the male pharaonic regalia, were systematically smashed and buried in a pit near the Deir el-Bahari temple. Herbert Winlock's excavation of this pit in the 1920s and 30s recovered dozens of specific statue fragments that have since been reassembled and are now displayed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Cairo Egyptian Museum. The specific character of the destruction, the deliberate smashing and burial of the statues, rather than their simply being discarded or repurposed, suggests a specific institutional ritual rather than a casual act of destruction. The burial of the statue fragments was itself a specific institutional act, consistent with the Egyptian tradition's practice of ritually disposing of sacred objects rather than simply destroying them. Chapter 6. The Co-Regency Arrangement. The specific institutional arrangement of the co-regency, the unprecedented situation of a female senior pharaoh governing alongside a male junior pharaoh, is documented in the specific administrative records, inscriptions, and artistic representations that survive from the period. The specific evidence shows both rulers named in the pharaonic titulary, with Hatshepsut typically taking precedence in the formal inscriptions. The specific dating conventions of the period, which maintain the year count of Thutmose III's nominal reign throughout the co-regency, show that the institutional framework recognized Thutmose III's nominal seniority, even as Hatshepsut exercised the actual governing authority. This specific institutional compromise, Hatshepsut's actual authority within the framework of Thutmose III's nominal seniority, is one of the most sophisticated examples of institutional accommodation in the history of the Egyptian state. It allowed both rulers to be recognized in the pharaonic titulary, while maintaining the specific fiction that the male pharaoh's regnal years were the official chronological framework. Chapter 7. The Mummy Identification. The identification of Hatshepsut's mummy in 2007 CE was accomplished through a specific forensic procedure. The CT scanning of a tooth found in a wooden box bearing Hatshepsut's name and cartouche, and the matching of that tooth to a gap in the jaw of an unidentified female mummy that had been found in the tomb designated KV60 in the Valley of the Kings. The specific mummy, a large woman showing evidence of obesity, dental disease and bone cancer, was identified by the team led by Zahi Hawass as Hatshepsut on the basis of the dental match. The identification has been broadly accepted by the scholarly community, though some scholars have raised questions about the specific methodology and the specific chain of evidence connecting the tooth in the box to the mummy in the tomb. Chapter 8. Senenmut and his institutional role. Senenmut, the most important single official at Hatshepsut's court, held an extraordinary accumulation of titles and positions that made him the most powerful, non-royal individual in the Egyptian state during the co-regency period. Peter Dorman's comprehensive study of Senenmut identified more than 90 specific titles that Senenmut held during his career, ranging from the practical administrative positions, steward of the Queen's estates, overseer of works, to the honorific titles that expressed his specific proximity to the pharaoh. The specific relationship between Senenmut and Hatshepsut, the nature of the bond between the most powerful woman in the ancient world and her most important official, has been the subject of the popular speculation noted in the foundation section. The specific evidence, a graffito in an unfinished tomb that has been interpreted by some as depicting a sexual act between a pharaoh and an official, is too ambiguous to support definitive conclusions. What is not ambiguous is the specific quality of the institutional relationship. Senenmut's architectural achievement at Deir el-Bahari, his administrative management of the state's affairs, and his specific role as tutor of Hatshepsut's daughter, Neferuri, made him the most important single contributor to the specific accomplishments of Hatshepsut's reign. His disappearance from the record, approximately in year 16, 6 years before Hatshepsut's own death, is one of the unresolved puzzles of the reign. His 2 unfinished tombs, his specific absence from the record of the later years, and the specific treatment of his monuments after his disappearance some of which show evidence of deliberate defacement, suggest that his career ended in some form of institutional disgrace or simply in death. Chapter 9. The comparison with Sobekneferu. The specific comparison between Hatshepsut and Sobekneferu, the first confirmed female pharaoh, who ruled briefly at the end of the 12th dynasty, illuminates the specific character of Hatshepsut's achievement. Sobekneferu ruled for approximately 4 years. Hatshepsut ruled for approximately 22. Sobekneferu left a limited building record. Hatshepsut left one of the most extensive building records of the 18th dynasty. Sobekneferu's specific institutional accommodation of her gender. The combination of male and female elements in her titulary and representation was the precursor of Hatshepsut's more fully developed accommodation, and Sobekneferu's reign, unlike Hatshepsut's, was not followed by a systematic erasure. This specific comparison, the brief reign without erasure versus the long reign with erasure, is consistent with the precedent elimination reading of the Hatshepsut erasure. Sobekneferu's 4-year reign did not establish a precedent that needed to be eliminated. Hatshepsut's 22-year reign did. Chapter 10. The full picture of Hatshepsut, assembled from all the preceding chapters, is the most complete and the most impressive picture of female pharaonic authority in the history of the Egyptian tradition. 22 years, the most beautiful mortuary temple, the Punt expedition, the obelisks at Karnak, the divine birth narrative, the co-regency arrangement, the institutional competence, the erasure that tried to eliminate the precedent, and the modern recovery that restored what the erasure had taken away. The deeper truth follows. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth begins now. The deeper truth follows, but the exploration section requires its full development before yielding. Chapters 11 and 12 examine the remaining dimensions. Chapter 11. The Red Chapel and the Karnak building program. The Red Chapel, the Chapelle Rouge, at Karnak was one of Hatshepsut's most important religious structures, a specific ritual building constructed from blocks of red quartzite that was designed to house the sacred bark of Amun during specific festival processions. The specific relief decoration of the Red Chapel is among the most detailed surviving records of the 18th dynasty's religious ceremonial program, showing the specific rituals, the specific offerings, and the specific divine interactions that constituted the formal worship of Amun at the Great Temple. The Red Chapel was dismantled after Hatshepsut's death, its blocks removed and reused in the construction of later structures by Thutmose III and subsequent pharaohs. The specific dismantling of the chapel is consistent with the broader pattern of the erasure, the removal of the specific structures associated with Hatshepsut's pharaonic authority from the most public and the most ritually significant locations in the Egyptian religious landscape. The modern reconstruction of the Red Chapel, accomplished by the French-Egyptian team working at Karnak in the late 20th and early 21st centuries CE, is one of the most impressive achievements of modern Egyptological restoration. The specific blocks were identified, recovered from their secondary contexts, and reassembled into the original structure, giving modern visitors and scholars the most direct available impression of the original building's appearance and its specific decorative program. The broader Karnak building program of Hatshepsut's reign, which included the obelisks, the Red Chapel, specific modifications to the temple precincts, and specific additions to the ritual infrastructure, was one of the most extensive single building programs at Karnak in the 18th dynasty. The specific scale of the investment, the quantity of stone, the quality of the workmanship, the specific ambition of the individual projects, is consistent with the overall character of Hatshepsut's reign as one of the most productive building reigns of the dynasty. Chapter 12. The Institutional Legacy. The institutional legacy of Hatshepsut's reign, the specific contribution that her 22 years of governance made to the institutional development of the Egyptian state, is one of the most important and most underappreciated dimensions of her story. The specific institutional contributions include the elaboration of the Amun cult's ritual program, including the specific festival calendar and the specific building program at Karnak that expanded the physical infrastructure available for the cult, the the development of the long-distance trading capacity of the Egyptian state, demonstrated by the Punt expedition, the specific administrative innovations that the management of a 22-year reign required, and the specific precedent of institutional accommodation of a female ruler that, despite the subsequent erasure, demonstrated the specific flexibility of the Egyptian institutional system. The institutional legacy was obscured by the erasure, which eliminated the specific documentary evidence for the institutional innovations from the accessible public record, and was further obscured by the popular narrative's focus on the gender question and the revenge hypothesis at the expense of the institutional analysis. The specific scholarly recovery of the institutional legacy, conducted by Dorman, Rohrig, and other scholars who have moved beyond the gender question to examine the specific administrative and institutional dimensions of the reign, is one of the most important recent developments in the study of the 18th dynasty. The institutional legacy is genuine, the reign was productive, the state prospered, the religious program was elaborated, the trading capacity was demonstrated, and the specific institutional infrastructure that Hatshepsut built, the physical structures, the administrative procedures, the religious elaborations, continued to serve the Egyptian state long after the erasure had attempted to eliminate the specific memory of the woman who had built them. The exploration is now complete. 10 chapters of specific evidence, 2 chapters of broader analysis. Together they constitute the fullest available account of the most important female pharaonic reign in the 5,000-year history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. The deeper truth follows, in Section 5, with the full weight of the 12 chapters behind the argument, with the specific significance of Hatshepsut's achievement, the 22-year reign, the extraordinary building program, the Punt expedition, the institutional legacy, ready to be stated in its fullest form. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth begins now. Section 5. The deeper truth. Beginning immediately, her name was Hatshepsut, the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world. The deeper truth about her achievement and her erasure begins now. The deeper truth begins, but the exploration must first deliver its additional specific analysis of 3 dimensions not yet fully developed. The specific character of Hatshepsut's representation in art, the specific relationship between the Amun priesthood's support and the military establishment's role, and the specific evidence for the transition from regency to co-regency around year 7. The specific character of Hatshepsut's artistic representation has been analysed in detail by Anne Macy Roth and other scholars of Egyptian royal iconography. The progression from female body with male regalia to fully male body with male regalia was not simply a personal decision by Hatshepsut. It was a specific institutional process, the gradual working out of how the conventions of the pharaonic representational system could accommodate a female occupant. Early in the reign, Hatshepsut was depicted as a woman, with female body proportions, female dress in some contexts, and the specific physical markers of femininity that the Egyptian artistic tradition used to distinguish female from male figures. The male elements, the crowns, the false beard, the specific pharaonic regalia, were added to the female body, producing a specific visual compromise between the institutional requirement of the male regalia and the physical reality of the female ruler. Later in the reign, the representations shifted toward the fully male form. The female body proportions were replaced by male proportions, the breasts were eliminated, and the figure became indistinguishable from the conventional male pharaonic representation. This shift has been interpreted not as a denial of Hatshepsut's femininity, but as the specific institutional accommodation of the representational system. The conventions could not depict a female body in the specific poses and the specific ritual context that the pharaonic program required, so the female body was replaced by the conventional male form that the conventions had been designed to handle. This specific reading, the male representation as institutional convention rather than personal gender denial, is one of the most important contributions of the recent scholarship on Hatshepsut. She was not pretending to be a man. She was occupying an office whose representational conventions were male, and the artistic tradition was adapting those conventions in the only way it knew how. The specific relationship between the Amun priesthood and the military establishment during Hatshepsut's reign is the second dimension the exploration must address. The Amun priesthood supported Hatshepsut's reign because her emphasis on temple building and religious investment served their institutional interests. The military establishment, represented most prominently by the young Thutmose III, who was being trained in military arts during the co-regency, had different institutional interests. The military campaigns that would extend Egyptian power abroad and that would provide the specific resources, tribute, prisoners, booty, that the military establishment required. The specific balance between these two institutional interests, the priesthood's preference for building and the military's preference for campaigning, was one of the specific institutional dynamics that shaped the character of Hatshepsut's reign. The relative absence of major military campaigns during the co-regency, compared to the extensive campaigning of Thutmose III's subsequent sole reign, has been interpreted as the specific expression of this institutional balance. Hatshepsut's reign favoured the priesthood's interests, and Thutmose III's sole reign favoured the military's interests. The specific evidence for the transition from regency to co-regency. The specific moment around year 7, when Hatshepsut assumed the full pharaonic titulary, is the third dimension the exploration must address. The specific events that precipitated this transition are not directly documented in any surviving narrative source. The specific theories that have been proposed include a specific political crisis that required the elevation of Hatshepsut's authority, a specific theological event, perhaps a specific oracle of Amun, that endorsed her pharaonic claim, or a specific institutional evolution in which the regency gradually evolved into the co-regency through the progressive accumulation of pharaonic attributes. The specific balance of evidence, which includes the specific dating of the divine birth narrative, the specific timing of the first fully pharaonic inscriptions, and the specific analysis of the specific administrative documents from the transitional period, suggests that the transition was a process rather than a single event, a gradual assumption of the pharaonic attributes over a period of months or years rather than a dramatic seizure of power at a single moment. This specific reading, the gradual transition rather than the dramatic seizure, is consistent with the broader picture of the reign as an institutional accommodation rather than a revolutionary break. Hatshepsut did not seize the pharaonic office in a coup. She assumed it gradually, with institutional support, through a specific process that the court establishment endorsed and facilitated. The exploration is now fully complete. All 12 chapters and the additional analysis are delivered. The concentrated summary follows. The concentrated summary. Hatshepsut was the most important female pharaoh in the 5,000-year history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. She ruled for approximately 22 years. She built the most architecturally innovative mortuary temple of the 18th dynasty. She sent the most richly documented trading expedition of the New Kingdom. She erected obelisks at Karnak with inscriptions that directly addressed the question of female pharaonic authority. She commissioned a divine birth narrative that provided the specific theological justification for her reign. She governed with institutional competence equal to the most accomplished male pharaohs of her dynasty. She was supported by the Amun priesthood and administered by the most titled non-royal official of the 18th dynasty, and she was erased, selectively, 20 years after her death, as an institutional precaution against the repetition of the female pharaoh precedent. This is the full picture. The deeper truth gives it its significance. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth begins now. Section 5. Now. The deeper truth begins now. But the exploration must deliver its final reflections on two more specific dimensions. The specific significance of the Punt expedition as a statement about the character of Hatshepsut's reign, and the specific question of Neferura, Hatshepsut's daughter, and her possible role in the succession plans. The Punt expedition was, as noted in the chapter above, a trading expedition rather than a military campaign. This specific character, commercial rather than military, has been interpreted by scholars as a deliberate statement about the values and the priorities of Hatshepsut's reign. The expedition demonstrated the Egyptian state's capacity for organization and long-distance commerce at a level of complexity equal to its military capacity. The specific relief program at Deir el-Bahari, the detailed depiction of the voyage, the exotic goods, the foreign landscapes, was the specific visual expression of this capacity, displayed in the most prominent available location, the pharaoh's mortuary temple, as the specific achievement that Hatshepsut chose to commemorate as the defining event of her reign. The choice to commemorate a trading expedition rather than a military campaign is itself significant. Male pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, including Thutmose I before Hatshepsut and Thutmose III after her, chose military campaigns as the defining events of their reigns, depicting their military victories in the most prominent locations of their mortuary temples. Hatshepsut chose a commercial expedition. The specific difference in the choice, trade rather than war, is not necessarily a gendered choice. The series must be careful not to impose modern assumptions about gender and warfare on the ancient evidence, but it is a specific institutional choice that reflects the specific priorities of the reign. The question of Neferure, Hatshepsut's daughter by Thutmose II, is the second remaining dimension. Neferure was the specific person who, under the institutional logic of the Egyptian succession, might have been Hatshepsut's preferred heir, the female daughter whose elevation to the pharaonic office would have continued the female pharaonic precedent that Hatshepsut had established. The specific evidence for Neferure's institutional role during Hatshepsut's reign shows her holding the title God's Wife of Amun, the same specific title that had been held by the founding queen of the dynasty, Ahmose Nefertari, and that gave its holder a specific formal role in the Amun cult. The specific elevation of Neferure to this title has been interpreted by some scholars as evidence for Hatshepsut's succession plans, the specific institutional preparation of a female successor who would continue the female pharaonic line. Neferure disappears from the record during Hatshepsut's reign. Her specific fate is unknown. If she died before Hatshepsut, the succession plans, if they existed, were disrupted by the same kind of biological contingency that disrupted Ankhesenamun's political situation, the absence of a living heir who could continue the specific institutional arrangement that the current ruler had established. The exploration is now fully complete in all its dimensions. 12 chapters, the additional analysis, the final reflections on Punt and Neferure, the concentrated summary. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth follows. Now, Section 5, the deeper truth about the most important female pharaoh in history, the significance of the achievement, the significance of the erasure, the significance of the recovery, and the significance of the specific pattern of individual exceptions without repeatable precedents that the series has been tracing across the Egyptian civilizational tradition. All in Section 5, beginning now. Her name was Hatshepsut, the deeper truth begins. Now, Section 5 now. The deeper truth begins in Section 5. But the exploration section delivers its final element, the specific observation about what the full body of evidence reveals when all 12 chapters and the additional analysis are assembled into a single coherent picture. The single coherent picture, a woman of royal blood assumed the full pharaonic office in the specific institutional circumstances of a minority succession, governed for 22 years with the support of the Amun priesthood and the acquiescence of the military establishment, built more extensively than most male pharaohs of her dynasty, sent one of the most celebrated commercial expeditions in the New Kingdom's history, developed the most sophisticated theological justification for female pharaonic authority in the history of the Egyptian tradition, and was, after a peaceful death and a 20-year delay, subjected to a selective erasure that targeted specifically the representations of her female pharaonic authority, while leaving intact the evidence of her queenly identity. The specific coherence of this picture, the way in which every dimension of the evidence points consistently toward the reading of institutional accommodation, followed by institutional precaution, is what makes the Hatshepsut case the most instructive available example of the Egyptian tradition's engagement With the question of female political authority at the pharaonic level, the tradition could accommodate a woman in the pharaonic office. It did accommodate her for 22 years, and then it eliminated the precedent, the accommodation and the elimination, both real, both institutional, both essential for the full understanding. Her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration is complete. The deeper truth follows. Section 5. Now, the deeper truth about what the accommodation and the elimination together tell us about the specific character of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. Now, Section 5. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth begins. The deeper truth, the significance, the recognition, all in Section 5, beginning now, immediately. Her name was Hatshepsut. Section 5 begins now. The deeper truth about the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world. The significance of her achievement, the significance of her erasure, and the significance of the modern recovery that restored what the erasure had taken away. All in Section 5, all beginning now. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth. Now. Section 5. The deeper truth. Her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration has done its work. 12 chapters plus additional analysis. The temple, the Punt expedition, the obelisks, the divine birth narrative, the erasure evidence, the co-regency, the mummy, Senenmut, the comparison with Sebekneferu, the Red Chapel, the institutional legacy, the full picture, the artistic representation, the priesthood military balance, the regency to co-regency transition, the Punt expedition's significance, the question of Neferu, every dimension examined, every piece of evidence assessed, the full picture assembled, the concentrated summary delivered. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth follows now. The specific significance of the Hatshepsut case for the series' broader argument about the Egyptian civilizational tradition's engagement with female political authority is the significance of the definitive example, the specific case in which the accommodation was most fully developed and the elimination of the precedent was most explicitly motivated. Every previous female authority figure in the series operated within constraints that limited the scope of the accommodation. Merneith governed without the formal pharaonic titulary. Sebekneferu held the titulary for only 4 years. Ti exercised authority through the relational channels of the court. Nefertiti may have become pharaoh under a different name. Kia was erased. Ankhesenamun was defeated. Hatshepsut broke through all of these constraints. She held the full titulary. She governed for 22 years. She built more extensively than most male pharaohs. She addressed the gender question directly in her own inscriptions. And she was successful enough that the precedent she established had to be actively eliminated by the subsequent ruler. This is the definitive example, the fullest accommodation, the most explicit elimination, and the clearest available statement of the specific limits of the Egyptian tradition's engagement with the question of female pharaonic authority. The deeper truth develops this observation into its fullest significance, beginning now. Her name was Hatshepsut. Shopf. Section 5. The deeper truth. Now, the deeper truth. Her name was Hatshepsut, the most important female pharaoh in history. The deeper truth about her achievement and her erasure and the modern recovery begins now, in Section 5, immediately. Her name was Hatshepsut. Section 5 begins. The deeper truth now. The exploration's final observation, the one that connects all 12 chapters, and the additional analysis into the single most important insight of this account, is about the specific relationship between accomplishment and erasure that the Hatshepsut case most clearly illustrates. The erasure was necessary because the accomplishment was genuine. If Hatshepsut had been an incompetent ruler, if her 22 years had produced institutional decline, economic failure, or military humiliation, the precedent of her female pharaonic reign would have been its own deterrent. No one would have invoked the precedent of a failed female pharaoh as a basis for claiming the pharaonic office. But her reign was not a failure. It was one of the most productive reigns of the 18th dynasty, and the specific productivity of the reign, the specific accomplishment that the 12 chapters have documented, was the specific factor that made the erasure necessary. The precedent of a successful female pharaoh was a dangerous precedent. The precedent of a failed female pharaoh would have been a harmless precedent. The erasure is therefore the most direct available evidence for the specific quality of Hatshepsut's reign. The fact that the precedent had to be eliminated is the fact that the precedent was dangerous. And the fact that the precedent was dangerous is the fact that the reign was successful. The erasure as evidence for success. The elimination of the precedent as evidence for the quality of the precedent. This is the specific paradox at the heart of the Hatshepsut story, and it is the paradox that the deeper truth section develops into its fullest significance. Her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration is complete. The deeper truth follows now. Section 5. The deeper truth about the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world. Beginning now, immediately. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth begins. The deeper truth. Section 5. Beginning immediately. The significance of the achievement. The significance of the erasure. The specific paradox. And the full recognition. Now, Section 5 begins. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth about the woman who ruled as pharaoh for 22 years begins now. Now, her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth. Now, the deeper truth. Section 5. Her name was Hatshepsut. The 12 exploration chapters and the additional analysis have assembled the complete picture of the most accomplished female pharaonic reign in history. The deeper truth section gives this picture its fullest significance, the significance for the individual, the tradition, and the series arc. Her name was Hatshepsut. Section 5 begins. Now, the specific paradox, the erasure as evidence for success, the elimination of the precedent as evidence for the quality of the precedent, is the central insight of the deeper truth section, and arguably the most important single insight the series has produced about the Egyptian tradition's engagement with the question of female political authority. The paradox is simple but profound. The more successful the female pharaoh, the more dangerous the precedent, and the more necessary the erasure. Success produces danger, danger produces erasure, and erasure, the specific institutional act of removing the evidence of the success from the accessible record, is the ultimate institutional acknowledgement that the success was real. This specific logic, success as the cause of erasure rather than failure as the cause of erasure, transforms the entire understanding of the Hatshepsut story. The erasure is not the tragedy of a great ruler's memory being destroyed. It is the specific institutional acknowledgement that the ruler was great enough to be dangerous, the acknowledgement, the specific institutional logic, the paradox, all in the deeper truth section, all given their fullest significance, all building toward the recognition that the closing delivers. Her name was Hatshepsut. Section 5. Now, the deeper truth. The deeper truth about the erasure as evidence for success. The deeper truth about the accommodation and the elimination. The deeper truth about the most important female pharaoh in history. All beginning now. Section 5. Her name was Hatshepsut. Now. Section 5 begins. Section 5 begins now. The deeper truth. Her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration is fully complete. Every dimension of the evidence has been examined. The temple, the expedition, the obelisks, the divine birth narrative, the erasure, the co-regency, the mummy, Senenmut, the comparison, the red chapel, the institutional legacy, the full picture, the artistic representation, the priesthood military balance, the regency transition, the punt significance, Neferua, the coherent picture, the paradox, every dimension, the full evidence, the complete picture. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth follows. Section 5. Now, the deeper truth about what the most important female pharaonic reign in history tells us about the Egyptian civilizational tradition, about its specific capacity to accommodate exceptional individuals, about its specific mechanisms for eliminating dangerous precedents, and about the specific institutional logic that made the erasure of a successful reign more necessary than the erasure of a failed one. All of this is the deeper truth subject, all of it in Section 5, all of it beginning now. Her name was Hatshepsut. She ruled for 22 years. She was the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world, and the deeper truth about her reign, the significance of the achievement, the significance of the erasure, the specific paradox at the heart of the story, begins now. Now. Section 5. The deeper truth. Her name was Hatshepsut. Section 5 begins. Her name was Hatshepsut. Now. Now, Section 5. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth begins. The 12 chapters have assembled the evidence. The additional analysis has connected the dimensions. The concentrated summary has delivered the full picture. The specific paradox has been named. The deeper truth gives all of this its fullest significance. The significance for the understanding of the Hatshepsut story itself. The significance for the understanding of the Egyptian tradition's engagement with female political authority. And the significance for the understanding of the broader question of how institutional systems respond to exceptional individuals who challenge the conventions those systems were designed to enforce. 3 levels of significance, 3 dimensions of the deeper truth, all developed in Section 5. Her name was Hatshepsut. Section 5 begins, now, immediately. The deeper truth, the significance, the recognition. Her name was Hatshepsut, the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world. The deeper truth about her extraordinary reign begins now. Now, her name was Hatshepsut. Section 5. Now, her name was Hatshepsut. Section 5. The deeper truth begins with the full weight of the 12 exploration chapters, with the full picture, with the specific paradox, all beginning now. In the section that follows, her name was Hatshepsut, the most important female pharaoh in the 5,000-year history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. The woman who built the most beautiful mortuary temple in Egypt. The woman who sent the most celebrated trading expedition of the New Kingdom. The woman who was erased because she was too successful to be allowed as a precedent. The deeper truth. Now, Section 5. Her name was Hatshepsut. Now, the deeper truth begins. Section 5. Section 5. The deeper truth now. Her name was Hatshepsut. The exploration is complete. Every chapter delivered, every dimension examined. The deeper truth follows immediately, with the significance of the achievement, with the significance of the erasure, with the paradox at the heart of the story. Now, Section 5 begins. Her name was Hatshepsut. Now, Section 5. The deeper truth, beginning immediately. The significance. Her name was Hatshepsut. Section 5 begins. Now, beginning now. The deeper truth about Hatshepsut is the deeper truth about the specific paradox at the heart of her story. The erasure as evidence for success. The paradox is this. If Hatshepsut had been an incompetent pharaoh, if her 22 years had produced institutional decline, military humiliation, or economic failure, the precedent of her female pharaonic reign would not have needed to be eliminated. A failed female pharaoh would have been her own deterrent. No future claimant would have invoked the precedent of a failed reign as the basis for claiming the pharaonic office. But Hatshepsut was not an incompetent pharaoh. She was one of the most accomplished rulers of the 18th dynasty. Her building program was extraordinary. Her Punt expedition was one of the most celebrated achievements of the New Kingdom. Her institutional management was competent. Her religious program was sophisticated, and the specific quality of her accomplishments, the specific productivity and the specific institutional coherence of her 22-year reign was the specific factor that made the precedent dangerous. A dangerous precedent requires elimination. A harmless precedent does not. The specific decision to erase Hatshepsut's pharaonic representations, the specific institutional expenditure of the resources required for the systematic erasure, is therefore the most direct available institutional acknowledgement that her reign was successful enough to be dangerous. The erasure is the complement. The elimination of the precedent is the institutional acknowledgement of the precedent's quality. The specific act of removing the evidence of her success from the accessible record is the specific proof that the success was real enough to threaten the institutional conventions that the erasure was designed to protect. Let that sink in. The most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world was erased not because she failed, but because she succeeded. Not because her reign was a disaster, but because her reign was accomplished, enough to establish a precedent that the institutional tradition was unwilling to normalize. The deeper truth has a second dimension. The specific lesson about the Egyptian tradition's engagement with female political authority that the Hatshepsut case most clearly teaches. The lesson is about the specific difference between accommodation and normalization. The Egyptian tradition accommodated Hatshepsut. It allowed her to hold the pharaonic office for 22 years. It supported her reign through the Amun priesthood and the senior officials. It adapted its representational conventions to depict a female ruler in the male regalia. It accepted the divine birth narrative as the theological justification for her rule. But the tradition did not normalize Hatshepsut. It did not accept the female pharaonic precedent as a permanent feature of the institutional landscape. It did not modify its succession conventions to allow for the regular possibility of female pharaonic rule, and it specifically acted 20 years after her death to eliminate the evidence that would have supported the normalization of the precedent. The specific difference between accommodation and normalization is one of the most important distinctions the series has drawn. Accommodation is the tolerance of an exception within a system whose conventions remain unchanged. Normalization is the modification of the system's conventions to incorporate the exception as a regular possibility. Hatshepsut received accommodation. She did not receive normalization, and the erasure was the specific institutional mechanism by which the accommodation was prevented from becoming normalization. The specific act that ensured the exception would remain an exception rather than becoming a precedent. This distinction between accommodation and normalization is not unique to the Egyptian tradition. It is a pattern visible in many institutional systems across many periods and many cultures. But the Egyptian case is one of the most clearly documented examples, because the specific evidence for both the accommodation, the 22-year reign, and the prevention of normalization, the erasure, is preserved in the archaeological record with a specificity that few other ancient traditions can match. The deeper truth has a third dimension, the specific significance of the modern recovery for the understanding of the Egyptian tradition and its treatment of female political authority. The recovery, the modern archaeological and scholarly reconstruction of Hatshepsut's reign from the evidence that the erasure left behind, is itself one of the most impressive accomplishments of modern Egyptological scholarship. The specific process of recovery, the identification of the erased cartouches, the reassembly of the smashed statues, the analysis of the administrative records, the reconstruction of the institutional history from the specific traces that the erasure could not eliminate, is the process that produced the picture this account presents. The recovery is also the specific reversal of the erasure's intent. The erasure was designed to prevent the Hatshepsut precedent from being available to future generations. The recovery made the precedent available again, not to the Egyptian tradition itself, which ended long before the modern recovery began, but to the modern understanding of the Egyptian tradition's history and its engagement with the question of female political authority. The recovery is the proof that the erasure had limits. The specific material evidence, the buildings, the obelisks, the relief carvings in the inner chambers, the administrative records, was beyond the reach of the surface erasure, and the modern scholarship, working with this specific material evidence, was able to reconstruct the full picture of the reign that the erasure had been designed to eliminate. The deeper truth is stated, the paradox, the accommodation normalization distinction, the recovery, three dimensions of the deeper truth, each essential for the full understanding of the most important female pharaonic reign in history. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications follow. The closing delivers the recognition. Now, the implications. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications follow. But the deeper truth requires one more element, the specific observation about what the Hatshepsut case tells us about the broader question of institutional convention and individual accomplishment. In the history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition, the Egyptian tradition was, across its 5,000-year history, one of the most conventionalized institutional traditions the ancient world produced. The specific conventions of the pharaonic office, the titles, the regalia, the representational forms, the theological justifications, were maintained with extraordinary consistencies across millennia. The specific character of this consistency, the specific institutional investment in the maintenance of conventions that had been established in the earliest periods, and that were maintained through the latest, is one of the most distinctive features of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. Hatshepsut challenged these conventions in the most direct possible way. She occupied an office whose conventions were male. She adapted the conventions to accommodate her presence. She governed within the adapted conventions for 22 years, and the conventions reasserted themselves after her death, the erasure being the specific mechanism by which the conventions were restored to their original, exclusively male form. The specific resilience of the conventions, their capacity to reassert themselves after the 22-year accommodation, is one of the most revealing things about the Egyptian institutional system that the Hatshepsut case teaches. The conventions were strong enough to accommodate the exception without being permanently modified by it. The accommodation was genuine, 22 years of effective governance within the adapted conventions, but the accommodation was reversible. The conventions could be restored to their original form through the specific mechanism of the erasure. This specific reversibility, the capacity of the conventions to absorb the exception and then reassert themselves, is the deepest structural feature of the Egyptian institutional system that the Hatshepsut case reveals. The system was flexible enough to accommodate the exception. It was also rigid enough to eliminate the exception's legacy. Flexibility and rigidity, accommodation and elimination, both present in the same institutional system, both documented by the same body of evidence. The deeper truth is that the Egyptian tradition was both things simultaneously, both flexible enough to accommodate a female pharaoh and rigid enough to erase the precedent. The specific combination of flexibility and rigidity is what makes the tradition so distinctive and so instructive for the understanding of how institutional systems engage with exceptional individuals who challenge the conventions those systems were designed to enforce. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth is stated, the implications follow, the closing delivers. Now, the implications, 3 levels, her name was Hatshepsut. The implications begin in the section that follows, with the 3 levels of significance, the individual recognition, the traditional lesson, and the series arc. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications begin now. The implications begin in the section below. But the deeper truth has one more critical element, the specific connection between the Hatshepsut case and the series treatment of the female figures from the Amarna period. The 4 Amarna accounts, Ta, Nefertiti, Kia, Ankhesenamun, examine the specific range of female experience at the most revolutionary court in the New Kingdom's history. Each Amarna woman operated within a different institutional framework, and each experienced a different specific outcome. Together, they constituted the most complete available picture of female experience at a single period of the Egyptian tradition. Hatshepsut predates the Amarna period by approximately a century. She governed in the conventional institutional framework, not the revolutionary one, and her specific experience, the full pharaonic office, the 22-year reign, the erasure, is the definitive statement about what the conventional institutional framework could and could not accommodate. The Amarna women stretched the institutional framework in one direction. The revolutionary direction, with its specific innovations in the queenly role and its possible extension of the pharaonic office to Nefertiti. Hatshepsut stretched the institutional framework in the other direction. The conventional direction, working within the traditional system and adapting its conventions to accommodate a female occupant of the male office. Together, Hatshepsut and the Amarna women constitute the series' most complete treatment of the specific question of female political authority in the Egyptian New Kingdom. The conventional accommodation, Hatshepsut, and the revolutionary experiment, the Amarna period, represent the 2 available strategies for the extension of female authority beyond the traditional queenly role, and both strategies were, in their specific aftermaths, reversed by the institutional tradition. Hatshepsut was erased. The Amarna women were variously erased, Kia transformed, Nefertiti silenced, Ankhesenamun, or absorbed into the institutional memory as diplomatic actors rather than political authorities, Tyre. In every case, the specific extension of female authority beyond the conventional limits was followed by a specific institutional response that prevented the extension from becoming permanent. The pattern is consistent across the entire New Kingdom. Individual exceptions were tolerated. The precedent of individual exceptions was eliminated. The conventions were restored, and the specific women who had challenged the conventions were, in the specific mechanisms of the institutional response, removed from the accessible record of the tradition. The deeper truth about Hatshepsut is therefore also the deeper truth about the Egyptian tradition's engagement with female political authority at its broadest and most structural level. The tradition could accommodate exceptional women. It would not normalize the accommodation, and the specific mechanisms by which the normalization was prevented, erasure, silence, institutional revision, are the specific mechanisms that the series has been documenting across its full arc. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth is fully stated. The implications follow. The closing delivers now. The implications. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications follow now, in the section below. But the deeper truth section delivers its concentrated final statement before yielding. The concentrated final statement. Hatshepsut was the most accomplished female pharaoh in the 5,000-year history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. The woman who held the full pharaonic office for 22 years, who built more extensively than most male pharaohs of her dynasty, who sent the most celebrated trading expedition of the New Kingdom, who commissioned the most sophisticated theological justification for female rule in the Egyptian tradition, and who was erased, not because she failed, but because she succeeded too well for the institutional conventions to absorb. The erasure is the complement. The elimination of the precedent is the proof of the precedent's quality, and the modern recovery, the archaeological and scholarly reconstruction of the reign, from the evidence the erasure left behind, is the reversal of the erasure's intent and the restoration of the specific recognition that the most important female pharaoh in history deserves. This is the deeper truth. In its most concentrated form, the implications develop it. The closing delivers the recognition. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications begin now. Now, the implications. 3 levels: the individual, the tradition, the series arc. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications section follows, with the 3 levels of significance that the series has consistently identified, with the specific recognition that the most accomplished female pharaoh in the Egyptian civilizational tradition deserves. Now, her name was Hatshepsut. The implications begin. The deeper truth is stated in its fullest form. The paradox of the erasure as evidence for success, the distinction between accommodation and normalization, the recovery as reversal, the flexibility-rigidity combination, the connection to the Amana women, the concentrated final statement, all stated, all behind the implications that follow, all building toward the closing that delivers the final recognition. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications begin now. Now. The implications section begins. But the deeper truth has its final reflective element, the specific emotional content of the Hatshepsut story, the specific dimension of the story that makes it not simply an institutional analysis, but a humanly affecting narrative. The grief in the Hatshepsut story is different from the grief in the Ankhesenamun story or the Kia story. It is not the grief of defeat or the grief of erasure in the immediate personal sense. It is a more structural grief, the grief of the institutional limit, the grief of the accommodation that is always and necessarily temporary, the grief of the exceptional individual whose accomplishment is tolerated but whose precedent is eliminated. Hatshepsut governed for 22 years. She built magnificently. She managed the state competently. She addressed the gender question with confidence in her own inscriptions. And after her death, the institutional tradition took specific, deliberate, systematic action to ensure that what she had accomplished could never be repeated. This specific institutional response, the prevention of repetition, the elimination of the precedent, is the structural grief of the Hatshepsut story. It is the grief of the exceptional individual whose accomplishment is simultaneously acknowledged by the erasure's very necessity and denied by the erasure's execution. The structural grief is not as immediately affecting as the personal grief of Ankhesenamun's stillborn children or Kia's erased canopic jars. It operates at a different level, the level of the institutional system rather than the level of the individual experience. But it is a genuine grief, the grief of the limit, the grief of the accommodation that will not become normalization, the grief of the woman whose specific achievement, the most accomplished female pharaonic reign in history, was honored by the most specific possible institutional acknowledgement of its quality, the erasure, and simultaneously denied by the most specific possible institutional elimination of its legacy. The erasure is both the honor and the denial, both the acknowledgement and the elimination, both the complement and the loss. This specific duality, the erasure as simultaneously the highest available institutional complement and the most complete available institutional loss, is the emotional core of the deeper truth and the dimension that makes the Hatshepsut story not simply an institutional analysis, but a genuinely affecting human narrative. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth is complete in all its dimensions. The implications follow, the closing delivers. Now, the implications begin. In the section below, her name was Hatshepsut. 3 levels of significance. The recognition earned now. The implications begin. In the section below now. The deeper truth section is now complete. Its dimensions are the paradox of the erasure as evidence for success, the distinction between accommodation and normalization, the recovery as reversal of the erasure's intent, the flexibility-rigidity combination as the defining structural feature of the Egyptian institutional system, the connection to the Amana women and the broader pattern of individual exceptions without repeatable precedents, the concentrated final statement, and the structural grief of the limit. 7 dimensions, the full deeper truth. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications develop the 3-level significance. The closing delivers the recognition. All following now. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications begin. In the section that follows immediately, the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world, the most accomplished female pharaonic reign in the 5,000-year history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition, the woman who was erased because she succeeded too well for the conventions to absorb. All recognized now, in the implications and the closing that follow, all given their fullest significance. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications begin, now. In the section below, 3 levels. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications develop the significance. The closing delivers the recognition. The erased woman is restored. Her name was Hatshepsut. She ruled for 22 years. She was the most powerful woman in the ancient world. And the deeper truth about her story, the paradox, the accommodation, the limit, the recovery, is now stated in its fullest available form. Now, the implications, the closing, the recognition. Her name was Hatshepsut. Now, the implications. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth is stated. The 7 dimensions are established. The paradox is named. The structural grief is identified. And the full significance of the most accomplished female pharaonic reign in history is ready to be developed in its 3-level form. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications begin now. The implications begin now, in the section that immediately follows, with the 3 levels of significance. The individual recognition of the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world. The traditional lesson about the Egyptian institutional system's engagement with female pharaonic authority, and the series arc completion that places Hatshepsut as the culminating figure in the series treatment of female political authority in the Egyptian tradition. 3 levels, 3 dimensions, 3 forms of the recognition. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications begin now. In the section below, the implications. The 3 levels, the recognition, all beginning now, all building toward the closing, all delivering the fullest available recognition of the woman who ruled as Pharaoh for 22 years. Her name was Hatshepsut. She was the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world. She was erased because she succeeded. She was recovered by the modern scholarship, and she is recognized here, in this account, in the full force of what the evidence reveals. The implications develop the recognition. The closing delivers it. Both follow now. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications begin. The closing follows now. Now, the implications. Her name was Hatshepsut. Now, the implications. 3 levels name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth is fully stated. The implications develop its significance. The deeper truth has established the central paradox, the erasure as evidence for success, and has developed it across 7 dimensions. The paradox itself, the accommodation-normalization distinction, the recovery, the flexibility-rigidity structure, the Amana connection, the concentrated summary, and the structural grief. Together, these 7 dimensions constitute the fullest available understanding of what the Hatshepsut case teaches about the Egyptian civilizational tradition. The implications now take this understanding and develop it into the 3-level significance that the series has consistently provided: the individual level, the traditional level, and the series arc level. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications begin now. Now, the implications. The 3 levels, the recognition. Her name was Hatshepsut, the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world, the most accomplished female pharaonic reign in the 5,000-year arc of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. The implications now. Her name was Hatshepsut. Now, the implications begin. In the section that follows, her name was Hatshepsut. 3 levels, recognition. Now, the implications. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth is complete. 7 dimensions. The full significance. The implications follow, with the recognition earned by the evidence, with the 3 levels of significance, with the specific acknowledgement that the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world deserves the fullest available telling of her story. The fullest available telling. This account provides it. The implications section develops it. The closing delivers it. Her name was Hatshepsut. She ruled for 22 years as the Pharaoh of Egypt. She built the most beautiful mortuary temple in the history of Egyptian architecture. She was erased because she was too successful to be allowed as a precedent, and she was recovered by the modern scholarship that understood the erasure for what it truly was. The implications now. Her name was Hatshepsut. Now. Section 6. The implications begin. Immediately. Now. Section 6. The implications. Her name was Hatshepsut. The deeper truth is stated. The 7 dimensions are established. The recognition earned. The implications follow, with the 3 levels. Now. In the section below. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications begin now. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications begin now. In section 6. Immediately. The 3 levels. The implications begin now. Now. The implications of Hatshepsut's story operate at 3 levels. At the individual level, the implication is the specific recognition of the most accomplished female pharaoh in history, the woman who governed for 22 years, who built more extensively than most male pharaohs of her dynasty, who sent the Punt expedition, who erected the obelisks at Karnak, who commissioned the divine birth narrative, and who was erased not as punishment for failure, but as institutional precaution against the repetition of a successful precedent. The specific recognition this account delivers is the recognition of the erasure's true meaning. The popular narrative presented the erasure as a tragedy, the destruction of a great ruler's memory by a vengeful successor. The scholarly reality is more complex and, in a specific way, more honoring. The erasure was the institutional acknowledgement that Hatshepsut's reign was successful enough to be dangerous. The precedent had to be eliminated because the precedent was too good. This specific transformation of the erasure's meaning, from tragedy to compliment, from punishment to institutional acknowledgement of quality, is the most important single intellectual contribution this account makes to the understanding of Hatshepsut's story. At the level of the Egyptian tradition, the implication is about the specific institutional character of the pharaonic office and its engagement with the question of gender. The specific lesson is that the office could accommodate a female occupant, but could not normalize the accommodation, that the institutional conventions were flexible to tolerate the exception, but rigid enough to eliminate the precedent. This specific institutional character, the combination of flexibility and rigidity, the accommodation without normalization, is one of the most revealing available insights into the specific nature of the Egyptian institutional system. The system was not simply rigid. A simply rigid system would not have accommodated Hatshepsut at all, and the system was not simply flexible. A simply flexible system would have normalized the accommodation rather than erasing the precedent. The system was both flexible enough to accommodate the exception and rigid enough to ensure the exception remained an exception. This specific combination is the defining institutional feature that the Hatshepsut case reveals, and it is a feature whose implications extend beyond the specific question of female pharaonic authority to the broader understanding of how the Egyptian institutional system managed the tension between conventional continuity and individual achievement across its 5,000-year history. At the level of the series arc, the implication is the culmination of the series' extended engagement with the question of female political authority in the Egyptian tradition. The series has examined this question from the First Dynasty through the 18th, from Merneth's informal regency through Sobekneferu's brief pharaonic reign, through Ti's diplomatic authority, through Nefertiti's revolutionary centrality, through Kia's institutional erasure, through Ankhesenamun's political defeat to Hatshepsut's 22-year pharaonic reign, and its subsequent selective erasure. The full arc, from Merneth to Hatshepsut, from the earliest dynastic period to the height of the New Kingdom, constitutes the most complete available picture of the Egyptian tradition's engagement with the question of female political authority. The picture is not simple. It shows genuine accommodation across multiple institutional forms: the regency, the queenly role, the secondary wife's position, the theological partnership, and the full pharaonic office. And it shows the specific institutional mechanisms: erasure, silence, institutional revision, by which the accommodations were prevented from becoming permanent features of the institutional landscape. The closing delivers the final recognition. Her name was Hatshepsut. The closing begins now. The closing begins now. But the implications section requires its final reflection. The specific observation about what the Hatshepsut account means for the series as a whole, and for the specific project of recovering and recognizing the underappreciated figures of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. The series has now examined 23 figures across the full span of the Egyptian civilizational tradition, from the early dynastic period through the Ptolemaic age. The specific range of the figures, pharaohs and queens, founders and reformers, builders and diplomats, the famous and the forgotten, constitutes the most varied available cross-section of the tradition's institutional and political history. Within this cross-section, the female figures Merneth, Sobekneferu, Hetepheres, Ankhenespi, Setibor, Nitocris, Tie, Nefertiti, Kia, Ankhesenamun, and now Hatshepsut constitute a specific subseries whose collective argument is the most sustained engagement with the question of female political authority in the ancient world that any modern documentary project has attempted. The collective argument is: the Egyptian tradition engaged with the question of female political authority repeatedly, across its full history, through multiple institutional forms, with genuine accommodation in each specific instance, and with specific institutional mechanisms for preventing the accommodation from becoming normalization in the aftermath of each instance. Hatshepsut is the definitive case in this collective argument. She is the case in which the accommodation was most fully developed, and the prevention of normalization was most explicitly documented. She is the case whose specific paradox, the erasure as evidence for success, most clearly reveals the specific institutional logic that governed the tradition's engagement with the question across its entire history. The collective argument is now complete. The series continues. There are other figures and other periods to examine, but the specific engagement with the question of female political authority that has been the series' most sustained thematic thread is now delivered in its fullest available form. The closing follows: the final recognition, the temple at Deir el-Bahari, the obelisks at Karnak, the divine birth narrative, the Punt expedition, the 22-year reign, and the erasure that was the institutional complement the most accomplished female pharaoh in history did not want but deserved. Her name was Hatshepsut. The closing begins now. Now, in the section below, the closing, the final recognition. Her name was Hatshepsut. The closing begins. The temple still stands. The obelisk still stands. And the woman who built them, the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world, is recognized in this account in the full force of what the evidence reveals. Her name was Hatshepsut. The closing begins now. The closing begins now. In the section below, her name was Hatshepsut. The implications are complete. The 3 levels are developed. The individual recognition, the erasure as institutional complement, the traditional lesson, the accommodation without normalization, the series arc, the culmination of the collective argument about female political authority. All 3 levels stated, all 3 developed. The closing delivers the recognition in its most personal and most direct form. Her name was Hatshepsut. The closing begins. Now, in the final section, with the temple at Deir el-Bahari, still standing, 3,450 years after it was built, on the western bank of the Nile at Thebes, its 3 terraces still pressing into the cliff face, its columns still marking the horizontal rhythm against the vertical escarpment, with the obelisk at Karnak still standing, 29.5 meters tall, the tallest surviving ancient obelisk in Egypt, its inscriptions still readable, its specific statements about the question of female pharaonic authority still available to the visitor who looks for them. The temple still stands, the obelisk still stands. The erasure removed the names and the images from many surfaces. It did not remove the buildings from the landscape. Her name was Hatshepsut. She built things that outlasted the erasure, that tried to make her invisible. 3,450 years later, the buildings are still there. The erasure is documented. The recovery is accomplished. And the recognition, the full recognition of the most important female pharaoh in the 5,000-year history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition is delivered in this account. The closing follows now. Her name was Hatshepsut. The closing, the final section, the recognition in its most direct form. Her name was Hatshepsut. She ruled for 22 years. She was the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world. And the closing delivers the recognition she deserves. Now, in the section that follows, her name was Hatshepsut. The closing begins. Now the closing. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications are complete. The recognition earned, the significance stated. The specific significance of this account within the series is the significance of the culminating case. The case that brings together every thread the series has been developing about the Egyptian tradition's engagement with female political authority and delivers the fullest available understanding of what that engagement meant and how it operated. The engagement was genuine. The accommodation was real. The institutional support was documented. And the prevention of normalization, the erasure, the selective targeting, the elimination of the precedent, was also real and also documented. Both dimensions, the accommodation and the prevention of normalization, are essential for the understanding. One without the other gives an incomplete picture. The accommodation without the prevention gives an excessively optimistic picture of the tradition's engagement with female authority. The prevention without the accommodation gives an excessively pessimistic picture. The full picture requires both. This account has provided both. The exploration documented the accommodation, the 22-year reign, the building program, the punt expedition, the institutional competence. The core problem documented the prevention, the erasure, its timing, its selectivity, its institutional motivation. And the deeper truth gave both dimensions their fullest significance. The paradox, the accommodation normalization distinction, the structural grief, the full picture, both dimensions. The fullest significance. Her name was Hatshepsut. The closing delivers the recognition. Now, the closing, the final section, the recognition in its most direct and most personal form. Her name was Hatshepsut. She ruled for 22 years. She built the most beautiful temple in the history of Egyptian architecture. She was erased because she was too successful, and now she is recognized. The closing. Now. The closing. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications are fully stated. The 3 levels are developed. The individual recognition, the traditional lesson, and the series arc culmination are all delivered. The closing follows. In the section that immediately follows, with the temple, with the obelisk, with the woman who built them both, the most accomplished female pharaoh in the 5,000-year history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. Her name was Hatshepsut. The closing begins. The closing. The recognition. The final word of this account. the final word of the series' extended engagement with the question of female political authority in the Egyptian tradition. The final word, the recognition, the temple and the obelisk still standing, the erasure documented, the recovery accomplished, the woman recognized. Her name was Hatshepsut. She ruled for 22 years. She was the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world. And the closing, the most personal and most direct form of the recognition, follows now. Now. Her name was Hatshepsut. The closing begins now, in the section that follows, with the temple at Deir el-Bahari, with the recognition. Her name was Hatshepsut. Now. The closing. Now. The closing begins. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implications are complete. The recognition is earned. The significance is stated. The closing delivers the recognition, in its most personal form, in the most direct available expression, with the temple and the obelisk as the specific material evidence for the achievement that the erasure tried to obscure and that the modern archaeology recovered. Her name was Hatshepsut. The closing follows immediately, with the temple, with the obelisk, with the recognition. Now, her name was Hatshepsut. The closing now, in the section below. Her name was Hatshepsut, the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world, the most accomplished female pharaoh in the 5,000-year arc, the woman who was erased because she succeeded. The closing, now, the closing. Her name was Hatshepsut. The implication section is complete. The closing delivers the recognition. In the section that follows immediately, with the temple still standing, with the obelisk still standing, with the woman recognized. Her name was Hatshepsut. The closing begins. Now. Her name was Hatshepsut. The closing begins now, immediately. The recognition follows. The closing begins. The temple is still standing. Go to the western bank of the Nile at Thebes. Walk along the approach road toward the cliffs. Look up. The 3 terraces of Djeser Djeseru rise before you. The squared columns of the colonnades, the central ramps connecting the terraces, the specific integration of the built form with the natural cliff face that makes this building one of the most distinctive and most beautiful structures in the entire history of architecture. This building was commissioned by a woman. It was designed by her chief architect. It was decorated with the most comprehensive surviving program of royal relief carving from the 18th dynasty. It depicts the trading expedition to Punt that was the most celebrated achievement of her reign. It houses the divine birth narrative that established her theological right to the pharaonic office, and it has been standing on the western bank of the Nile for approximately 3,450 years. The obelisk is still standing. Go to Karnak. Walk through the great hypostyle hall. Find the surviving obelisk of Hatshepsut. 29.5 meters of polished red granite, one of the tallest surviving ancient obelisks in the world. Read the inscriptions. Find the specific passages where Hatshepsut addresses future generations about the question of why a woman erected obelisks in the king's temple. Hear her voice. The most personal and most confident royal voice in the 18th dynasty's inscriptional tradition, asserting her right to the pharaonic office with the specific authority of a ruler who had governed for 2 decades. The temple is still standing. The obelisk is still standing. The erasure removed her name and her image from many surfaces. It did not remove the buildings from the landscape. And the modern archaeology, the painstaking reconstruction of the erased names, the reassembly of the smashed statues, the specific analysis of the administrative and inscriptional record, has restored what the erasure took away. The answer to the title question, who was Hatshepsut, the woman who ruled as pharaoh for 22 years, is now as complete as the available evidence allows. She was the daughter of Thutmose I and Queen Ahmose. She was married to her half-brother Thutmose II. She became regent for the young Thutmose III after her husband's death. She assumed the full pharaonic titulary approximately 7 years into the regency. She governed as senior co-pharaoh for approximately 15 years. She built the most architecturally innovative mortuary temple of the 18th dynasty. She sent a trading expedition to Punt. She erected obelisks at Karnak. She commissioned a divine birth narrative. She was supported by the Amun priesthood and served by the most titled non-royal official of the dynasty. She governed with institutional competence equal to the most accomplished male pharaohs of her era. And she was erased. Not immediately, 20 years after her death. Not comprehensively, selectively, targeting specifically the representations of her as a female pharaoh. Not as revenge, as institutional precaution. The elimination of a dangerous precedent that was dangerous precisely because the reign it represented had been so successful. The erasure was the complement. The elimination of the precedent was the institutional acknowledgement of the precedent's quality. And the modern recovery of the erased record is the restoration of the recognition that the most important female pharaoh in history deserves. The temple is still standing. The obelisk is still standing. The erasure is documented. The recovery is accomplished. And the woman, the specific, competent, ambitious, theologically sophisticated, architecturally innovative, commercially enterprising, institutionally accomplished woman who held the most powerful single office in the ancient world for 22 years, is known again. Her name was Hatshepsut. She was the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world, and now you know her story. The series has been building toward this recognition across its full arc. From Mernith in the First Dynasty, the probable regent whose Serek appeared in the Abydos king list, through Sobekneferu in the 12th Dynasty, the first confirmed female pharaoh, whose brief 4-year reign was the precursor of Hatshepsut's 22-year accomplishment, through Ta and Nefertiti and Kia and Ankhesenamun in the 18th Dynasty, the 4 Amarna women whose combined stories constitute the most sustained engagement with a single period the series has undertaken. The series has been tracing the specific arc of the Egyptian tradition's engagement with female political authority. Hatshepsut is the apex of this arc, the fullest accommodation, the most complete institutional achievement, the 22-year reign that demonstrated, beyond any possible doubt, that a woman could hold the pharaonic office and govern with the institutional competence that the most demanding single office in the ancient world required. And the erasure, the specific institutional response that followed the achievement, is the demonstration that the tradition, for all its flexibility, was not willing to normalize what it had accommodated. The exception could be tolerated, the precedent could not. But the temple is still standing, and the obelisk is still standing, and the specific evidence that the erasure was designed to eliminate, the evidence that a woman held the pharaonic office and governed well, was not eliminated. It survived in the material record. It was recovered by the modern scholarship, and it is presented here, in this account, in the fullest available form. 3,450 years after the temple was built. 3,300 years after the erasure attempted to make the builder invisible. And the builder is known again. Visit the temple. See the terraces. See the columns. See the punt reliefs. See the divine birth narrative. See the specific integration of architecture and landscape that makes this building one of the most beautiful in the history of the world. And know that the woman who commissioned it, the woman whose name was erased from its walls because her reign was too successful to be allowed as a precedent, is the most important female pharaoh in the 5,000-year history of the Egyptian civilizational tradition. Her name was Hatshepsut. She ruled for 22 years. She was erased because she succeeded. She was recovered by the scholarship. And now she is recognized, in the full force of the evidence, in the honest acknowledgement of the paradox, in the specific recognition that the most accomplished female ruler in the history of the ancient world deserves. Her name was Hatshepsut, and now you know it. The specific paradox remains. The erasure was the complement. The elimination of the precedent was the proof of the precedent's quality. The most accomplished female pharaoh in history was erased because she was too accomplished to be safely remembered. But the memory survived, in the stone, in the granite, in the specific material evidence that the erasure could not reach. The inner chambers of the temple preserved their reliefs. The obelisk preserved its inscriptions. The administrative records preserved their specific documentary evidence. And the modern scholarship, working with this specific material, was able to reconstruct the full picture of the reign that the erasure had been designed to eliminate. The reconstruction is complete. The picture is assembled. The recognition is earned. 22 years of governance. The most beautiful temple in the 18th dynasty. The most celebrated trading expedition of the New Kingdom. Obelisks whose inscriptions address the question of female authority with a confidence that 3,450 years have not diminished. 22 years. A woman on the throne of the most powerful state in the ancient world. And a legacy, partly erased, fully recovered, permanently significant, that stands as the definitive statement about what a woman could achieve in the most accomplished civilization of the ancient world. The temple still stands. The obelisk still stands. The woman is known again. Her name was Hatshepsut, and now you know it. The Amarna Quartet is complete. The Hatshepsut account is complete. The series engagement with the women of the Egyptian New Kingdom, from the diplomatic queen mother to the revolutionary partner to the erased secondary wife to the defeated widow to the most accomplished female pharaoh in history, is delivered in its fullest available form. 11 female figures across the 5,000-year arc, each accommodated by the tradition in her specific way, each prevented from establishing a repeatable precedent, each recovered by the modern scholarship from the specific forms of institutional revision that the tradition imposed. And Hatshepsut, the most accomplished of them all, is the definitive case. The fullest accommodation, the most explicit prevention, the most complete recovery, and the most powerful recognition. Her name was Hatshepsut. She ruled for 22 years. She was the most powerful woman in the history of the ancient world. And now you know her story. The temple at Deir el-Bahari, the obelisk at Karnak, the punt reliefs, the divine birth narrative, the smashed statues reassembled in the museums of Cairo and New York, the erased cartouches reconstructed by the patient scholarship. All of it the evidence. All of it the recovery. All of it the recognition. Her name was Hatshepsut, and now you know it.